are in Baird country. Okay, welcome to Baird country. Today we have Adam Shoalts. Adam is a national best-selling author. He has canoed across the Arctic. He's canoed through the Great Lakes to the Arctic on another trip. He is an archaeologist. He has a PhD from McMaster University, and he is one of the most hardcore, if not the most hardcore, backcountry, remote Arctic travelers by canoe and authors, I would say, in the world at this point.
Well, thank you, Jim. That's very nice of you to say.
You're very welcome. Was that a pretty good rendition?
That was one of the best introductions I've ever had.
Yeah.
You're a natural at this.
Thank you.
You missed your calling. You should have been doing this years ago.
Oh, Adam, I'm merely just a man. So I just finished your book, Where the Falcon Flies, and I've watched a whole bunch of your stuff. But man, there's so many stories in there. And there's one I remember. You're on the Coppermine River in the barren grounds, and you're poling your canoe upriver, standing in your canoe, pushing with a pole against this really, really strong current, and with so many miles to go in front of you. What I guess what was going through your mind when there was all these miles in front of you to go and this current was pushing back at you?
Yeah, that was the journey alone across the Arctic, almost 4,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
And I'd done a lot of homework beforehand, trying to invent a route that would get me from the Yukon to basically Hudson's Bay. And I studied as many different rivers, waterways as possible. But I knew inevitably I'd have to do a fair amount of upstream travel, which naturally you'd want to avoid if you could. But there was no way to cross that many different watersheds and travel downstream every single time. You're starting in the Bering Sea watershed, so most of the rivers are flowing west. You've got to get to the Hudson's Bay watershed where most of the rivers are flowing east. And in between, in all that vast geography, you have major river systems like the Coppermine, which is flowing almost due north, the Mackenzie River. So I looked at it from as many different perspectives as possible to try to minimize the upstream travel. But there was no getting around the Coppermine River. I knew this is going to be the hardest part of my entire journey. It was the only part that really filled me with any sort of doubt. Where I didn't know if my plan would be feasible.
Right.
I had not been to the Coppermine River before, but I'd read up on it as much as I could. And I knew it's a very powerful river, very, very strong, rip-roaring current, whitewater rapids, canyons. Is upstream travel even possible on it? I couldn't find any account of anyone trying to go upstream on it.
Never heard of anybody doing it.
And every single wilderness canoeist, people who'd paddled in the Arctic before, when they heard that I wanted to go upstream, just laughed at me and said, that guy's an idiot. That's completely impossible. That's like trying to canoe up the Niagara River. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
But my sort of, I don't know, my secret weapon, my fallback plan in any scenario, I've always believed in the tortoise versus the hare. That slow and steady wins the race, and that what at first glance might seem impossible in fact can be accomplished if you're simply patient and you just keep putting one foot in front of the other. If you stay determined and mentally strong, you'll get there eventually. So my strategy was, I know the current is going to be impossible to paddle up. There's going to be no paddling. I don't even know if I can pull off the bottom. It might be too deep. Current might be too strong even for that. But if all else fails, I can portage along the side, or maybe I can walk along the side and basically line the canoe or tow it with a rope. Or if I can't use a rope because there's too many obstructions, boulders and things, I can grab onto it with my hand. So I was like, with all these different options on the table, one way or another, I have to be able to get up this river. And by the time I got to the Coppermine River, I was like 2 months into this journey. So I had 2 months of effort to get to that spot in the middle of the wilderness. And I'm like, there's no way I'm quitting and turning back now. So even if it takes me another month, I'm going to get up this river. And I think it was about 522 kilometers is the number stuck in my head that I had to go.
Wait a minute. You went up the Coppermine for 522 kilometers.
But the good news is that a lot of that is the lake. So it flows through some lakes. So I knew that would have relief.
So piece of cake then, right?
So the hard part was like, I think it was just over 200 kilometers of like pure river with extremely strong current.
Right.
And I'm like, in the grand scheme of things, 200 kilometers isn't that bad. You know, maybe I can't do more than 10 kilometers a day and it's going to take me 20 days. The first day was the hardest. I remember I did 13 kilometers and it was brutal. It took like everything. Like there were times where I would just be dragging the canoe with my hand kind of stumbling along the shore, which is all like loose rocks and boulders about the size of a skull. So really easy to lose your grip on.
Yeah.
And there were times where I'd come to cliffs and I'd be like, now it's blocked. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have to try to ferry across to the far side of the river where there's no cliff and then edge my way up there. And there was very little poling in that first section because the current was just too strong even to pole, or there were too many boulders and obstructions in the river. So it was just a lot of like dragging the canoe along the bank, sometimes using a rope and lining with the rope, which would always be dicey because I'd be up above on rocks or cliffs and realizing, if I do this, if I make one mistake, this thing's going to flip over. So I try to avoid that as much as I could. But my mindset was like the tortoise and the hare. If I just keep going, I'm going to get up this river. And once I'm up it, it's just a couple more 1,000 kilometers and I'm at the end of this route. So there we go.
Yeah. And then that Coppermine was just a part of the entire journey. So how many days did it take you for your upriver part on the Coppermine? How many days did that take you? 500 and whatever kilometers.
Well, some of that was lake as well. I think there's a couple of weeks, I think. I can't remember off
That's
the top of my
pretty
head.
good.
Yeah.
And you probably were in really good shape by that time too, because
I
you'd
was 2
already
months in,
So this is just to put it into perspective for people. When you were traveling from Eagle Plains all the way to
Baker Lake.
Baker Lake. I was going to say Melville Lake. They kind of look similar on the map. This is just a 2-week section. So imagine by the time you got to Coppermine, you're probably in like extremely good physical shape, right?
Yeah.
If you like started your trip out doing that, you might not have made that kind of time. Like I noticed myself, I think the most hardcore upriver thing I've ever done is going up part of the George, about 12 kilometers on the George, which was very challenging. And I noticed when I get into a trip like that, just your ability to jump from rock to rock, and you really like, you start to be able to become kind of a well-honed machine when you're in an adventure like that after a while.
Oh yeah, people ask me all the time, what kind of training do you do to get in shape for an expedition? I'm like, well, I always think of the expedition is the training, and the first 2 weeks is like your crash course. After 2 weeks, you should be ready to go. So I think like the actual lifestyle is the training, and on a long journey, that journey was 4 months. So I was like,
oh, it was 4 months.
4 months.
Okay,
yeah.
I got mixed up. I thought it was only 3. But
Well, you kind of mixed up
three.
2 different expeditions.
Oh, okay.
Where the Falcon Flies is Lake Erie to the Arctic.
Right. Yes.
Or that's beyond the trees.
Yes.
The Yukon. But that's forgivable.
No, I didn't actually mix those up, but there are a few big trips that you've done, to say the least. But what I mixed up, I think, was just Melville Lake compared to Baker Lake or something like that, and 2 different, like, in my mind or whatever. But no, that's quite the adventure. Oh, you mean by the time Where the Falcon Flies was 3 months.
Where the Falcon Flies is a 3-month journey.
Baker Lake was 4 months.
A 4-month journey.
Yeah. So how much, so you have a window that you're working with here. It's not like, you have how much food you have, and, you can catch fish, which you do sometimes as well. There's other ways to kind of get food on the land, but your main thing that you're racing against when you're in the Arctic, in such a remote place like that, is you're racing against winter. Right? Like the water is going to be hard. You're going to be snowshoeing. You're not going to have the kind of clothes that you have. How close were you by the time you got to Melville Lake before it freeze up?
Well, probably it wouldn't actually get too cold for another 4 weeks. But the big factor that was really limiting canoeing by September, end of August in the Hudson Bay watershed is wind.
Okay.
Because I was coming from the west to the east.
Yeah.
Prevailing winds are sweeping off of western Hudson's Bay, and it's making almost impossible headwinds that you can't paddle against.
Okay. Yeah.
As the summer goes on, temperatures warm up, the wind gets worse and worse. Most people will tell you, the good wind window pretty much comes to an end by the middle of August. I knew no matter what, inevitably, I would need a lot more time in the middle of August. But I was thinking, by middle of September, 3rd week of September, conditions are really deteriorating. And at that point, you have to figure on almost 1 out of every 2 days is a day that you're shore bound because the wind is now too strong to paddle.
1 out of every 2.
Oh, easily. Yeah,
wow.
easily. There's when I did all my homework reading through past reports, there was one from the 70s. I think it was for the Federal Ministry of Natural Resources. A dozen guys on a canoe trip in what was then the Northwest Territories, now Nunavut. They were windbound for 2 weeks on a point where they couldn't canoe at all because the wind night and day was relentless. So even if you wanted to sleep during the day and try to get out of there at night, taking advantage of the midnight sun, they still couldn't do that because the wind was just
Wouldn't stop.
relentlessly howling. Yeah.
That is such a challenging feeling to be windbound, because what keeps going through your head is this ever going to end? I remember I was on the Beaufort Sea at the most of the Cuju on Western Victoria Island. We were windbound for 4 or 5 days, and that felt like 2 weeks easily. And we actually were stupid, and we decided, well, it died down. I guess it's always just like this here. And we just like went out there and started paddling in it, which was extremely dangerous. And, we didn't make it far. Fortunately, we were okay. But to imagine having to be pinned down by wind like that. And if you get into the water, you like in your situation, what would happen if you tried paddling in that?
Well, it depends on
Yeah.
the circumstances.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that exact scenario
Yeah.
you're describing where you're windbound and, minutes feel like hours, hours feel like days.
Yes.
And even though this isn't rational, the wind has
Yeah.
to die down. Your body's telling you you're stuck here forever.
Right.
You just have to go, and then you end up taking risks that you didn't intend to. And
Yeah,
we've all been in that
yeah.
scenario
That's
on
what
any
I did.
long canoe journeys.
I regret you. A terrible way to learn, but I sure as hell learned my lesson out there doing that.
Oh, I've taken many risks too, where I
Yeah,
shouldn't have
yeah.
paddled in high winds on Hudson's Bay or even on the Great Lakes. On my most recent journey, paddling on Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, there were times when
Yeah.
I should have been on shore, but then you have this urban landscape, highways, people looking at you, and you're like, I just want to get out of here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to risk it. And
Yeah.
it depends on which direction the wind's coming from. If it's a headwind, tailwind, if there are waves, if there are no waves, all these things have to be taken into account. But that was really what was driving me on is, yes, the deteriorating weather in terms
Yes.
of temperatures and ice,
Yeah.
but also the wind. I knew the wind is only going to get worse. I remember there was a
Yeah.
day on August 8th on my journey, and I came to a lake in the central Arctic, and the wind was just howling. There were
Yeah.
huge whitecaps. I tried to paddle into them, but it was impossible. It was just pinning me on shore. And what was constantly in my mind was, it's only August 8th.
Oh my God.
I can't imagine in another month
Yeah.
what the wind's going to be like on September 8th
Yeah.
when the really strong, almost hurricane force winds come.
Yeah.
So I was trying to push on as much as I could. There were a few times on my route where I wasn't on a lake, I was on a river. And it's like, okay, well, now at least there's no white caps. I can keep going, but the wind would be so strong. I mean, I was on the Hanbury River, and I'd be paddling down it, and I'd be like spinning like a corkscrew, where even though the current was strong, normally you could just sit on this river and the current would do all the work. But the wind
Yeah.
coming up easily overpowered the current and would push me back up the river. I ended up shifting all the weight in my canoe to the bow, so the bow would sit lower in the
Right.
water,
Yeah.
catch less wind.
Yeah.
And just paddle as hard as I could to edge into the wind down this river along the banks. Eventually, when I couldn't do that, I strapped on my waders, got my rope, and just dragged the canoe behind
Yeah,
me. I was thinking, again, tortoise the hare, even if I'm only doing 1
Yeah.
kilometer an hour, that's better than 0 kilometers an hour. And psychologically, it's a lot better than just sitting there thinking this wind is never going to let up.
Right. Yeah. I can really relate to that on a smaller scale, just breaking it up. I don't have to go another 1,000 kilometers. I just got to do 5. I do that with portage. I don't think I have 4 kilometers to go. I say 300 meters, and then I take a break. 300 meters, I take a break. And it seems way easier at the end of the day. I remember watching Alone, which was your documentary called again?
Alone Across the Arctic.
Alone Across the Arctic, which is on YouTube. It's on Amazon Prime as well. So you're filming this, but that's the trip that you also wrote your book, Beyond the Trees,
Yes.
on that trip.
Yeah.
And so you're journaling, you're filming. There's a lot of other things than just your own survival while you're out there too. How much more does the documenting of your journey for your books take, in addition to the filming while you're out there?
Well, I mean, there are times when you're so exhausted, you
Yeah.
feel like I can't possibly pick up a pencil and write anything in my notebook.
Right.
But I always force myself to, because I find that my best writing material happens in the moment.
Okay.
Now,
Yeah,
when I'm
yeah.
paddling and battling
Yeah.
the wind, that's impossible. You'd be foolhardy to try to whip out your journal. But what I do is I try to discipline myself
Yeah.
to write at least once a day, every day on a long journey while
Right.
it's still fresh and vivid in my mind. Usually
Yeah.
that's the end of the day. The last thing I do before falling asleep in my tent, I'll scribble as many notes into my journal as I possibly can. Anything I saw during the day that I want to remember, any metaphors that came to me, like, oh man, the cliffs on that lake looked exactly like some ruined Scottish castle, the way the light was hitting it. I'll try to write that down in the moment. Otherwise, I'll never
Beautiful.
remember it, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, amazing.
that's what I do. Now, as far as filmmaking goes, I admire guys like you who do the filming because I think
Right.
that's way more time consuming.
Yeah.
I've only ever really filmed one of my journeys, which was alone across the Arctic.
Yeah.
Which I was thinking I had to do by necessity, hoping to offset some of the costs I incurred.
Mm-hmm.
But I really think of myself as a writer. Writing books is my bread and butter. That's what comes more naturally to me. So I enjoy the writing. I can't complain about that. Filmmaking is hard. Then you have to set up cameras, take them down.
Charge them. You had some experience
Exactly.
trying to keep things charged out there as well.
A pencil, you just sharpen it with your pocket knife and then you're good to go. Cameras, you have to fiddle with solar panels or extra batteries. And it's a lot more work that goes into that. And that's like a whole other thing. So when I did my most recent long journey from Lake Erie to the Arctic, that was 3,400 kilometer journey. And I just thought into it, I'm not really going to put any effort into filmmaking. Yes, I'll bring my GoPros and hit play when I'm going through rapids or waves. But I was like, I really just, writing is what brings me joy.
Right.
I like writing books.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to focus on that and film incidentally.
Yeah.
Because as you know, if you want to make something with good production values,
Yeah.
you have to devote a lot of time just to filming. And I put in a lot more effort.
How do you do both, right?
It's difficult, yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I've always thought about trying to write a book. I don't have the background in history. One of the things I find so fascinating of your books is that you really have two stories. You have your story of where you're going, but then you have the story of historical events that happened in that area. And it was a few years back. You ended up writing a book on it. This was your Alone Against the North, which was your first book. And I remember you got onto my radar. I think it was like an article in the Toronto Star or something like that. And you were doing the Again River. And this is a river that has no record of travel on it, right? And what I think captured people is that you found a waterfall, unfortunately, by accidentally going over it, but then realized, okay, this isn't documented. And I think just the idea, which really got you a ton of interest and a ton of media exposure, is that, hey, there's still things out there that haven't been discovered. And were you a Canadian geographic explorer in residence at that time, or?
No, I was doing an expedition for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, but I didn't become explorer in residence until 2018.
Right.
Yeah, that's taking me back a while. That was 10 years ago, a decade ago.
Right. And that was your first book, which really people really gravitated to, and that's sort of what spawned your career as a writer after that, I suppose.
Yeah, that was my first book. When I wrote it, I remember thinking, like, I don't know if anyone's ever going to read this. If 100 people had read that book, I would have been like blown away. I can't believe 100 people read this book. But as it turned out, that book became a national bestseller. I think it spent something like 24 weeks on the national bestseller list.
Right.
And I was shocked by that. I really didn't expect there would be so much appetite for old-fashioned adventure stories or canoeing stories. But I tried to take a different approach to writing the book. I mean, as you alluded to, I weave a lot of history into the story.
Yes, yeah.
So that's my natural background. My PhD is in history and archaeology. And if I could, I would just write pure history books. That's what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis.
I love history.
Yeah, I'll be neck deep in research on Vikings in the Arctic, and I'll be like, I wish I could just write an academic article on this, but
you could just write a book on one of my Arctic trips as Vikings in the Arctic.
Well, that could work.
I get called a Viking. I don't know why. It's crazy.
If you can go back in time 1,000 years ago, I would be all over that. So, or put me in time 1,000 years from now, and then I'll do it. But I like history. And the older, the better. From my perspective. So I try to weave a lot of history into my books. And I was surprised that the books have done as well as they have. Yeah.
And what kind of gave you the feeling of writing? Like, obviously you have a background, but this was your first book. What was it that kind of triggered you and that told you, hey, I want to be able to write a book. I'm going to do it. Like, what was going through your mind when you decided to take that leap and put it all on the table and just start putting pen to paper?
Well, I'd written a lot ever since I was a teenager. I'd written hundreds of articles. My first published article, I was still in high school, and I kept writing as a teenager and all into my 20s as a student. Freelance here and there. My first published pieces, I wrote a column called Reflections of a Naturalist. We were all about wildlife and environmental issues, conservation, all different wild animals in Canada. So I had a lot of experience writing under my belt, even at the time that I wrote my first book.
Yeah. Okay.
And it was actually, I didn't do anything. A literary agent came to me and said, I've read a bunch of your articles, and I know you do these expeditions for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. And he tried to persuade me, write an actual book. And I said, well, I love reading books, so I'd be happy to write them. I mean, reading is, other than the wilderness, my happy place on earth is in a library around books.
Right.
So I love reading. I'm always reading, multiple books. A few years ago, I was asked to be a judge for a big literary prize, and I got to read 100 books in one summer.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
And so I love reading, and it was sort of a natural transition to write something a little bit longer. And I was lucky enough that an agent had come along and pitched the idea to me. He said, you should write a book about your expedition to the Again River. And I said, okay, I don't think anyone's going to read it, but if you're convinced, I'll do it just for the joy, right?
Yeah.
And I will do that sometimes for my own amusement. I'll just write stories that I don't publish and I don't ever want to submit. But I just, for the fun of it, enjoy putting the pen to the paper and writing a story. It could be like, I'm going to write this gothic Halloween story that's going to be really fun, and it's just for me. So I'll do that. That's just part of the process.
So this is a passion of yours.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, and that's so you're able to basically take your passion of nature, of canoeing, of history, and also sort of reliving history on your own 2 feet in a way by following some of these historic routes. Like, one of the things that was really striking was to me is in your book, Where the Falcon Flies, was paddling on Lake Erie. I'm going to be honest with you. I had no idea Lake Erie was this interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm just reading this book. I'm like, I got to go to Lake Erie. I'm always going north. I got to go to Turkey Point and some of these places that you mentioned, because I think we forget the amount of history, battles, shipwrecks, pirates that even existed on the Great Lakes. And you really kind of brought that to life in a very interesting way, which I guess was different than most of your trips, which are in the far north, northern reaches of Canada, the Arctic, and all these kind of places that give goosebumps to the adventurous at heart when you hear the name Labrador. So what was it like to trying to paddle in somewhere that's more of an urban landscape for a guy that's like this northern traveler?
Well, I mean, I knew it was going to be a different challenge than anything I'd ever attempted before. I was like, I'm literally going to have to camp in Toronto. I'm going to have to camp in Montreal with my canoe, my tent. I had no idea what to expect, but I just thought it was all part of the adventure. I didn't have anything worked out ahead of time. I just thought wherever I end up, I end up. If I have to sleep under the Burlington Skyway, I'll sleep under the Burlington Skyway. If I have to sleep under the Jacques Cartier Bridge in Montreal, I'll sleep under the Jacques Cartier Bridge. But it was partly the thought of the history and getting to see it from a unique perspective from the stern of my canoe that appealed to me and led me down that path to setting off from Lake Erie to the Arctic. I was like, adventure is everywhere. We don't necessarily have to be deep in the wilderness to experience adventure. You could canoe the Hudson River to New York City if you wanted to, and that would be a totally different type of adventure.
Right.
So that, and I partly was motivated by, I really want to make a record of what Canada looks like in the year 2022 through my own eyes. This is what it's like paddling underneath the Burlington Skyway or alongside the Toronto waterfront, home to millions of people. The good, the bad, everything. I want to put it in here. The litter. I don't think I'm going to camp here because there's so many discarded needles.
Right.
I'm going to go over here. And then you find wonderful surprises. Like, look at all this amazing green space where I never expected to find it in Scarborough. This is like a natural paradise. It's an oasis. Here I am in the biggest city in all of Canada, but I feel like I'm Robinson Crusoe on some uninhabited island because it's a cold, rainy day. It's deserted. There's hardly even a dog walker around. And here I am setting up my tent within the city limits of Toronto, backed by this rich Carolinian forest, shagbark hickory, cottonwood. I mean, it is feeling like stepping back in time. So I loved every moment of it. And that entire journey, I mean, I count my lucky stars because it was like every day was a revelation. I saw things I never expected. And I would stumble, like sometimes, I'd be in Quebec in some small village and I stumble upon some old stone chateau that's 300 years old. Other times it would be a tree that was like 400 years old.
Wow.
A glimpse of an Arctic species like semi-palmated sandpiper or a peregrine falcon flying to the Arctic. I mean, it gave me a real appreciation that there's nature in everyone's neighborhood, on everyone's doorstep. And it really reinforced to me the ties that bind Canada's landscapes, whether you live in southernmost Ontario or the Arctic. It's all interconnected, and you could do a journey from one place on the map to another. The only limit is really our own imagination. So, I mean, to me, it was just, a wonderful experience throughout.
Wasn't it so interesting how it was the falcon, your favorite bird, which everyone knows is like the most badass bird out there. Their diving speed's 200 miles an hour or something like that.
Yeah.
And essentially what you're doing is you're following, where you were living on Lake Erie at the time, you're more or less following a route of the falcon migrating north to the Arctic, to where they nest and where they have their young. And did you ever sit back after you walked the Trans-Labrador Highway, part of which I've driven it multiple times, which to me is like monumental accomplishment. But when you put in, once you got to it was the Quebec. What's the one from? It was from Baie-Comeau, 389. Sorry, not the Trans-Labrador. Yeah. It gets into the Trans-Labrador, and then you started at Labrador City, put your canoe in there. And then after, looking back, after paddling past Toronto, these skyscrapers, being on the Great Lakes, what did it feel like? Was it just surreal, or what was the emotion to be in this like deep wilderness area, literally by your own means, after passing these sort of much more urban areas?
Yeah, it was definitely a contrast. There were contrasts throughout. I mean, in some ways, just to go back to Lake Erie or rural Lake Ontario, that was a shocking contrast from the GTA.
Right.
And this is something that was very strange. Like you could be on eastern Lake Ontario around the Bay of Quinte or Port Hope, and that in itself already feels like a world away from Toronto, right? It's an entirely different experience to be paddling through cow farms and cornfields and woodlots than it is to be paddling beside skyscrapers and traffic and asphalt and concrete and glass. So Labrador was another contrast. Now I'm like, oh, this is boreal forest and balsam fir and black spruce, and I'm in another landscape. But I saw it as all sort of interconnected on any long journey.
Interesting.
Like
and
if you're doing
a
road trip, I guess, across Canada, you're going to see like, oh, the 100th meridian, the Great Plains begin, and I come out of the rugged Canadian Shield and the forest around, Lake of the Woods. Now I'm onto the plains. And then you get to the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And finally you end up on the temperate rainforest on the Pacific coast. But it's like everything is different, but it's all interconnected. And that's sort of how I felt on this journey. And it was sort of like the gradual transitions. Everything is blending in, right? So as I'm getting into northern Quebec, even along the St. Lawrence, it's like it's really getting a lot more wild here, right? Cell towers, they're disappearing. That was the last farm. That was one thing I was interested in, is where's the most northern farm in Quebec? And when you're in the St. Lawrence Valley, it's farm country. There's lots of farms. But as you're getting north of Quebec City, the farms start to peter out. And it's like, oh man, there's still the odd farmer. They must have a great family history, how they're holding on here in this very rugged, rocky landscape. And then eventually you come to a place where there's no farms and you see, it's transforming. Now there's still towns here, but the economy is now based on lumber, right? It's all forestry here, and eventually those disappear as well, and you get into the more mining areas. So I was interested in really the whole picture of what does Canada look like in the 21st century. And you see like, okay, here at Toronto, obviously the economy is based around the digital age. There's thousands of people just in that one building working on computers. Here it's all farming. Here it's forestry. Here it's mining, right? So
as a geographer, that must be such a deeper way of learning about geography. And like you ever see, it was, I think, Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf said, the world is not in your books and maps, it's out there. Talk about, you could read about everything you just explained in a book, but when you're getting out there and you're traveling by traditional means and you're actually seeing this, I imagine that your understanding and knowledge of it almost kind of goes beyond what even could really be described in writing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wish that our education curriculum, that there was a way for it to have more field trips, because subjects like geography or history, you really can't learn just from the printed page. Right. There's such a visual component where you actually have to go out and visit these sites or walk in a forest. I mean, it's amazing nowadays. People can study even forestry But if it's all on a computer, then you go out in a forest and it's like it's an alien environment where you barely
Right.
recognize the tree species you're looking at.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a big believer in getting out on the land.
Yeah.
One thing geographers do, which I enjoy, I mean, I love looking at maps, don't get me wrong, but they classify all different ecosystems. And it'll be like, okay, here's Southern Ontario. Let's shade it in purple. This is Carolinian zone, Carolinian forest, just along Lake St. Clair, Detroit River, Lake Erie into Niagara. And then let's shade in the next one. Let's pick a different color, orange. We'll call this Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest. Let's shade it all the way up to Magnetawan. And we'll say that, the characteristic species are red oak and red pine and sugar maple and silver birch. And then let's come up with another color. Okay, well, let's use yellow, and we'll shade in boreal forest. And we'll say it starts right here at Temagami.
Right.
So on the map, it's all cut and dried, where it's
Right.
like, this is one zone, this is another ecosystem. But partly what appealed to me about this journey was like, I want to actually see it in real time, because of course those divisions are not going to be clear cut. It's going to be like gradual over a week. The cottonwoods start to fade out along the St. Lawrence, and all of a sudden I'm noticing balsam fir. Further south, there was no balsam fir. It was all eastern hemlock. Well, where did that transition start? And it's like, oh, well, my map is not actually very precise. It's actually got Trois Rivières wrong or something like this. So that's a fascinating thing to see in real time. Also, the maps themselves. So, as you well know, topographic maps can still have mistakes on them and errors, especially when they're made by remote sensing, where you're only ever using a satellite or an air photo, and trying to change that into a pictorial representation of what's out there. Human error can creep into the map, or animals, beavers, they can change the landscape. They can flood something out. Or a beaver dam over
to
years.
you.
Yeah, that happens in Labrador. So that's very exciting. I mean, I think partly people think, oh, it's the year 2024. There's nothing left to explore. Everything can just be seen on a laptop. But to me, it's very exciting. It's very liberating to think, to bring it back to your story of Gandalf, it's kind of like we forget with all of our modern technology. In one sense, yes, the world is a shrinking place. We can do a podcast from anywhere. We can do a Zoom talk from anywhere. You can book a flight and fly halfway around the world. But if we put away all that stuff and we get out under our own power, under our own steam, on foot or by canoe, the world is as big as it ever was. I mean, as big as it was in 10,000 BC, it's like that in 2024 when you start traveling by foot or by canoe. And to me, that's so exciting, because it opens up so many opportunities for adventure, for exploration. Just get out there and see it with your own eyes.
Yeah, interesting. And it's hard to really understand what that means. It's, take it back to when you were talking about watersheds. The amount of people that have no idea what that means, or, because now you have a city and there's like a grid pattern of roads. The way that the land lies means absolutely nothing to them. And of course, the way that the land lies is the way that water flows, and the way that everybody used to travel, and only a very few select people still do travel that way. I had a question today, a comment today on my YouTube channel, somebody asking me why the ocean is still, but yet the river that you're on is moving. You know what I mean? And it's just like, and this guy wasn't embarrassed, asked what I would consider to be, one of the dumbest questions I've ever heard.
Oh, don't say that.
I
no
shouldn't.
Dumb question.
But I'm just like, it's not a dumb question. The guy's probably smarter than me in 10 other subjects. But I mean, people have really kind of lost touch with that. And it's very hard to articulate to somebody how much that resonates with you. Crossing the height of land, which is a divide between the way two watersheds flow, and what creates the rivers to flow, all these kinds of things. You really get to see the country, even by bicycle. I've only ever done like one big kind of bike journey. Wasn't anything super special, but I biked from like Toronto almost to Kingston, and by that time my butt was like super sore, and we were going to miss the homecoming parties in Kingston, so we just got to drive the rest of the way. I was younger, and I just remember seeing everything in a totally different light, all these small towns and stuff like that. And I would totally agree with you that with what you say, is it's something that more people got to get out there and see, because it really changes your perspective. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing the things we can explore in our own backyards. I mean, we live life at such a fast pace now, traveling 100 kilometers down the highway in a vehicle, or flying even faster than that in an airplane. And you pass by all these places. And even, I mean, it's amazing. People can live their whole life in one town, and not even explore what's in the radius around their town, because it takes a lot of time and effort to just go out on foot.
Yeah.
And like your story of the bicycle ride from Toronto to Kingston, it's like maybe you've driven that 401 highway 100 times, but it's like you didn't notice any of these little features.
Not a thing.
Until you slow it down and you actually start to notice all this detail. So there's something definitely to be said for traveling the old-fashioned way. And it can be very rewarding, right? I mean, that's partly what's so enjoyable about it. Even if you're just hiking the Bruce Trail, which thousands of people do, when you get up on some of the northern sections of the Bruce Trail, like around the Beaver Valley, it's like astonishing how beautiful that is. When you're not driving by the highway super fast, but you're actually walking, and you can start to see, I can understand why people would call this the mountain. Because when you're down below in that farm country, I mean, 200 years ago, when you didn't have the luxury of Netflix and internet, this really would have seemed like a mountain. I mean, it's astonishing, the sudden relief here where the landscape just thrusts up so dramatically, right? So if you lived around there, that would seem like a mountain.
Absolutely.
And I love how like that name carries on in local roads. Like it'll be Mountain Road, and it's like there's no mountains around here.
Well, in Hamilton, they call it the mountain.
Exactly, yeah. And it is a mountain. I mean, in the old days, people lived life so much more locally, right? So if you were stuck at the head of the lake, you were born and raised there, that really would be a mountain to you.
Totally.
And when you climb all the way up it, I mean, it's like, wow, that was actually quite the climb. I got winded, and now look at this vista. From the top of this peak here.
When you're not in real mountains, you don't have to climb up so high to get a good view.
Yeah.
Right. Where when you're in the Rockies, to get a great view, I mean, the view is incredible, but you gotta like really put in some effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Some sweat equity, which is another thing. What, like, people would look at this kind of stuff that you do and say, why? Well, like, how is it, this doesn't look like fun, you know? And I would say, you know, people call it type 2 fun, or people say, you know, it's fun afterwards, which I really like. Are you ever in the time feeling just like miserable? Why have I done this? I don't want to go on. And how much time afterwards does some of those more challenging trips take to reflect on and say, oh my God, that was awesome. What's the next trip?
Yeah, I mean, good questions. When I was younger, in my teens, early 20s, mid 20s, many of the adventures I do, like I would endure and just sort of grit my teeth and say, I've committed to a month, I'm going to do this expedition.
Yeah.
But there would be lots of miserable moments, as you're describing, where like the black flies are atrocious, the mosquitoes are horrible, my feet are wet, the weather has been awful. But you would just sort of endure. And like you said, you look back upon it when you got home fondly.
Yeah.
But over time, I think I've sort of gradually learned to embrace even the more adverse moments.
Embrace the suck.
Yeah. So when I'm paddling, I'll be like, you know, it's wet, but sometimes you feel more alive now that I'm soaking wet and the wind is, you know, blowing into my face and I'm paddling here. And I started to think to myself, you know, this is living. I feel like a very rich experience that I can't get when I'm staring at my laptop inside my house.
Right.
And I try to remind myself to be grateful for that moment, that I'm lucky enough to have the opportunity to do this canoe journey and to be here on this bay on the St. Lawrence River, paddling into this headwind outside Trois-Rivières and looking at these swamps where, you know, quarter of a millennium ago, an American army came here and fought the local French Canadians outside Trois-Rivières in these swamps. And here am I paddling. There goes a green heron paddling into this same wind. And I'm like, man, this is such a rich experience. I'm counting my lucky stars that I'm able to experience it. So I kind of actually reproach myself in that moment.
You're giving me goosebumps here, Adam.
I'm reproaching myself in those moments.
Look at that. Wow. Amazing.
Well, that's because you're an adventurer too. We're cut from the same cloth. So now you're getting out. You're like, I want to get out there and paddle that same river, and experience that same thing, right? Because you can relate to it. And that's what I tell myself. You know, I reproach myself in that moment and say, no, that's, you know, shame on me to feel, you know, regret that I'm here, because I'm like, this is what I live for. This is what you dreamed of as a 7-year-old kid when the whole world was full of possibility and adventure and wonder. I mean, I'm lucky enough that in my mid-30s, I still experience this. And I mean, that's what gets me motivated. I mean, everyone has those moments where you wake up inside your tent and you're in your sleeping bag and you're comfortable. And it's like, I just want to sleep for another hour. But I tell myself, that's not why I came to these mountains, or that's not why I came to the Arctic. Life is out there beyond the tent. Let's get out and start living it. So, you know, get busy living is the kind of thing I tell myself.
Right on. Yeah. I remember hearing Mike Horn, and he was kite surfing across Alaska, or kite sailing across, Antarctica. And he kept telling himself the same thing. You know, if I'll progress if I get out of the tent, which is much more of a just cut and dry point A to point B thing, but I imagine he's trying to get to the end and he says, "Oh man, it'd be so comfortable to lie in my sleeping bag for a little bit more, but that's not why I'm here." And I guess that's where that's kind of like what you're explaining of being there on the St. Lawrence and being in that place where all this has happened. That sounds like where you get your kind of passion and inspiration from. And I can see in ways that you're like me, as much as I'm, inspired by your adventures and your books and by things other modern day people do. It's for me, it's like a lot of my heroes, the people that I get my inspiration from, aren't around anymore.
Yeah,
you know
absolutely.
what I mean? How can you do that? Well, I mean, in 1750, this wasn't a big deal, right? Well, how did they do it? Let's find out how they do it. Let's emulate that and do it. You know what I mean? And a lot of the time, that's who I'm inspired by is the early explorers, indigenous explorers, people that lived on the land and did these amazing things. A lot of the time, are what gets me going. Can you relate to that?
Oh, absolutely. I remind myself all the time. I mean, you have to use every little mental trick you can to stay motivated,
and
tell yourself, "Oh, it's not that bad. Keep going." And that's definitely to me a major one, which I remind myself, hey, people generations past didn't have any of these modern gadgets and luxuries. They accepted hardship as simply a way of life. I mean, you don't even have to go back centuries. You go back even more recently, people who grew up on a farm. It was like before tractors and modern things, every day was hard labor from sun up to sundown. And I tell myself, like, mentally, physically, they were just used to doing these kind of hardships that now we balk at. So I tell myself, like, no, it's not that bad. Keep going.
It's all mental.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think it's amazing how fast standards change, right? Some new gadget comes out or some new piece of gear in like 2016. And if by 2021 everyone isn't using it, it's like, you're insane, you're reckless. And it's like literally millions of people didn't have this, who went camping like all through the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And they themselves thought that they were already spoiled compared to what their grandparents were doing.
Now I'm like, is that Gore-Tex or Gore-Tex Pro?
Yeah, exactly.
I got to have the Gore-Tex Pro. It's just, of course, that's like way better than, leather, what people used to wear, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like a must.
Yeah. Sometimes, I mean, now I'm lucky that I have the kind of sponsors and, I can afford the better gear. But sometimes I think back to my earlier journeys when I was on a shoestring budget. My gear was either homemade, came from garage sales, or Canadian Tire.
Well, the canoe you use on the Again River to begin with wasn't exactly a top-notch watercraft.
Not at all. I mean, all my early canoe trips were with homemade canoes. My father and I, my brother, we used to build cedar strip canoes or birch bark canoes, and all of my canoe journeys were with those up until about my mid-20s. Okay. And then at that point, I was like, it was actually more just, there's a lot of work goes into these cedar strip canoes. They're like a thing
good,
of art.
But they don't take, they're probably amazing and they look beautiful, but they can't take the beating that like modern day canoe materials can, right?
Well, and I felt bad that I was always damaging my canoes and it'd be a lot of work, and I'd be like, oh man. So I was like, I have to buy a canoe, and I had no money. I was 25. So I would literally go in that time on Kijiji, secondhand, right?
Yeah.
And be like, oh man, my budget's like $400, $500, maybe $800 if I really scrounge up. Yeah. And you can't buy like a top of the line canoe. You'd buying something third hand or fourth hand that's been banged up and repaired. I remember I got a fiberglass canoe, probably from the early 70s, for free. It was at someone's cottage in the Muskokas. They were throwing it out because it had been repaired so many times. It was like threadbare, and they had it stored outside in the winter just on the ground, and it was buried. And they're like, I just want to get rid of this piece of junk. You can have it. It's got so many holes in it. So I repaired the whole thing with like fresh fiberglass, built new gunnels, new seats. And I took it out on one journey to James Bay, and it was like completely punctured beyond repair. I ended up giving it away myself. Yeah. And I did that for years. It wasn't until 2015 that I finally had Novacraft Canoe, who I know you're also an ambassador for Novacraft Canoe, right? Yeah. Where I finally had Novacraft Canoe give me a canoe. Yeah. And I still use that canoe now, 9 years later. Yeah. And it was a lot more durable. But the irony is, sometimes I look back at my earlier adventures and I say, I sometimes think I had more fun
Yeah.
with the shoestring gear,
Right.
where I didn't have top of the line stuff.
Yeah.
And it was sort of Huckleberry Finn, my side of the mountain. You know,
Yeah.
you just make the best of it with what you've got, homemade.
Yeah.
And I mean, certainly traveling light is
Piece
fun,
of wood
right?
with a string on the end for fishing.
I was never that desperate. I still had a Canadian Tire rod.
Right,
Might have
yeah.
been the cheapest one, but
Yeah,
I know I never had to get to like hobo
Yeah.
fishing.
So essentially what you're saying too is that you don't have to have top of the line gear to get out there and enjoy the outdoors and even do some pretty advanced level excursions and trips.
Well, probably not.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want anyone to misinterpret what I'm saying. I don't
Right.
really have a philosophy.
Right,
My
yeah.
philosophy is whatever works for you, do it.
Right,
If you
yeah.
want the best of the line gear and you're
Yeah.
able to buy it, by all means get it.
Yeah.
I'm not one of those people who's going to criticize you. I think
Yeah.
if you have that in your toolkit, more power to you. But if you're also like, 18-year-olds watching this and it's like, I can't afford any of this stuff, I don't think
Right.
that should hold you back necessarily. Thousands of people for countless generations have done these kind of adventures without all this stuff. So there's no
Yeah.
reason why you can't too.
Totally.
Of course, you have to be
Yeah.
smart. We don't want people to do anything
Yeah.
reckless or dangerous. I mean, you have to study and do your homework, make sure you know what to do in those scenarios. But
Yeah,
really,
right. Don't head out there and do something crazy with inadequate gear. You got to be careful what you say to people because it is important to know what you're doing. But I don't want people to feel like they can't go and do something at some level unless they blow thousands and thousands of dollars.
Yeah, it's like anything.
know?
I mean, you use the example
Yeah.
of cycling, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you go into a bike shop, it's astonishing how expensive like a new top of the line bike is, right?
Yeah.
But if all you have is like some cheap bike from Canadian Tire or Walmart, there's no reason why you should be prevented from going
Right.
out and enjoying that, right?
Yeah, you might not lap Lance Armstrong, but you're going to get to point A to point B.
You could still ride from Vancouver to
Right.
Halifax on that bike if that's what you want to do.
Probably,
right?
yeah.
People have done it,
Yeah.
and there's no reason why you can't do it.
Yeah.
If you're motivated, I mean, the sky is the limit,
Love
essentially,
it.
right?
Love it. So, Adam, how did you? I guess I'm interested to know a little bit more. And some of this I read in your book, but how did you get into this wilderness travel? Find a passion and say, I really want to take this to the next level, and I want to go alone to some of the most remote places in the world. And it's a kind of a two-tiered question is, at what point did you realize I have to do this? Like, what was going through your mind when you said, this is something that I'm so passionate about, I'm going to take on the enormous task of authoring these books and sticking with it, not just one book, but another book and another book, more trips, and essentially making your livelihood out of it. And, how do those kind of two things sort of tie together?
Well, my fascination with wilderness, I think, stemmed from like the earliest age, probably when I was
Yeah.
like 5 or 6 years old. I think it's probably a universal thing. You can find it in cultures all over the world, on all continents.
Yes.
People are attracted to the wild. I mean, that's our DNA. 99.9% of our evolutionary history, we lived outside as hunter-gatherers.
Until recently.
Very recently,
Yeah.
right? In the grand scheme of things. So probably there's some sort of innate latent tendency in everyone. But for me, where it came from, to be more specific, I grew up in rural Southern Ontario, which I think was a fabulous place to grow up. Again, I count myself lucky that I grew up in
Yeah.
the countryside of rural Southern Ontario. So where I grew up, we had a quiet country road. There were no streetlights. There were no sidewalks. We still chopped wood to heat our house.
Nice.
All these sorts of things. And around my house was nothing but swamp forest. So for my brother and I and our dog, that was our playground every day, right? That's the playground was just in the woods. We didn't have a swing set or anything. We just went into the forest
Right.
and we would build what we called as kids forts.
Right.
I don't know why we call them forts. but-
Bushcraft shelters, they're called now.
Oh, is that what they are?
Yeah, survival shelters.
Well, we would just build forts.
That's how you get away with doing them when you're growing up.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Right,
So
right.
as a 5-year-old, that fort was to protect us from like monsters
Right.
and axe murderers and Freddy Krueger and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And we'd have like Swiss Army knives and we'd make spears with sticks.
Right. Cool.
And I remember like on a very young age, like the age of 7 or so, being fascinated by this idea with my brother and our dog of how deep we could go into the forest, the farthest we could get from our house. And sometimes we'd be out there for hours and my mom didn't like that. And she would like honk the horn on our van to tell us like it was time
These
to come
kids
back.
are too feral.
Yeah. So, but I was fascinated by the idea of how deep can we go into the forest? And when
Yeah.
you're 5, like 30 meters into the woods feels like you're in the middle of the
Right.
Alaskan wilderness.
Totally,
And like you
yeah.
could get eaten by a Kodiak bear at any
Right,
second, right?
right.
So it's amazing the effect that has on your imagination.
Yeah.
But for us, I think it was about not even a kilometer, you could go into the woods and then you would come to another country road. So the deepest spot in the wilderness behind our house was in the middle, where you're like 500 yards, 500 meters maybe from the nearest road.
Right.
And I became fascinated with that spot as a little kid because that was the deepest wild spot. And if you had a map, you could measure the distance in straight lines to our house and all of the neighbors' house. Like, oh, there's the Comfort's farm.
Right.
Here's this house, the Smith's house over there. And we're like 600 meters from there, 700 meters from here. That's the most wild spot we can get to. So that's where we'll have our campfire. That's where
I'm
we'll build
impressed
our fort.
with the amount of like figuring you did at such a young age.
I was always fascinated by maps and like figures, right? I used to draw maps, doodle on my placemat as a kid with like my frosted flakes, draw these maps of Canada or just the woods around my house.
Nice.
And then that fascination, I mean, it held me over as a 7-year-old, but as I got a little bit older, I was fascinated by that same idea. So we would do canoe trips on weekends, my dad and my brother and I. And if we had like 3 days, my entire philosophy mantra would be like, well, let's try to get as deep in from the parking lot as we possibly can.
Right.
Even if it's 20 kilometers, 25 kilometers, 30 kilometers, how deep are we actually getting into the backcountry, into the wild, into the wilderness? And my brother would usually be like, well, let's just go somewhere where we can catch good fish. Like he loved fishing.
Right.
But I, for some reason, was fascinated by this idea of getting as far in from the parking lot, from the road as we could. In a weekend, you can't get that far. Like 25, 30 kilometers would be it. Then you're probably going to start coming into some other area of cottages or road.
Yeah.
And that fascination never left me in high school. I mean, I was lucky grade 8. For some reason, Mr. Bianchini had us read Farley Mowat, Lost in the Barrens.
Nice.
And I was like, oh,
Read
man.
that one as a kid too.
Exactly. It's like, now this is not Ontario. This is like northern Manitoba. I've been doing the calculation in my head as a 13-year-old. I'm like, there are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest road.
Yes.
So as a teenager, now that I'm in like the 11th grade, 12th grade, I started thinking like, well, how can I get farther? So with my best friend, Wes, we would do road trips north of Lake Superior. The road that goes up to Pickle Lake.
Yes.
We'd be like, this is as far as we can get. This is the end of the line in Ontario. This is the most northern road you can drive. And then we would set off from there. That's what I did after high school. And this fascination with like, the most remote spot or getting the farthest you can from the parking lot, it carried on into journeys that took me farther and farther afield. So that's how it started as a kid. And then as far as the books, I was always kind of bookish. Like maybe not when I was really young. I was too rambunctious and wild. But by my later years in high school, I was really into reading. And I would just consume literature. Anything I could lay my hands on. Could be a history book like Pierre Burton. Could be a wilderness story like Farley Mowat. But I'd also read like, here's a horror story about zombies in Texas. And I'm going to read that too because they had it in the school library. So I would just read everything I could, put my hands on. Yeah. And when I went to university, I remember I didn't socialize at all. All I would do is read books. I was like always, my head was in books.
Right.
I would go into the library and just randomly pull books off the shelf.
Yeah.
Like, oh, a book on Egyptian mummies. This looks interesting. Oh, a book on the fur trade in New France. I'm going to read this. Yeah. And maybe a Sherlock Holmes detective story. I'll put that in there. So I liked reading a lot.
Right.
And when you like reading, I guess writing sort of flows naturally from that.
Right.
So I already kind of recounted a little bit how when I was in my later 20s, a literary agent actually came to me and said, I'd read some of your shorter articles when you write about animals and things. Would you want to write a book? And I said, well, I can't say no if you're asking. So I started writing that book, which became Alone Against the North.
And it after you wrote that and you looked at that book, did you look at it and say like, this is what I want to do? Like, this is what I want to keep doing. Like, how did you feel when you had that first book in your hand documenting this amazing journey that had inspired so many people?
Well, I knew I wanted to write books even when I was a teenager. I remember in my high school yearbook where you put like where you're going to be in 10 years. It's like playing in the NHL or doing
Which
this.
you're also a hockey player.
I like hockey.
That's how you got a lot of your exercise, your training, I noticed, up in Sudbury.
Yeah. As soon as I came in your place, I was like, oh, Jim plays hockey.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I saw right away the skates.
Yeah, I love
like kindred
hockey.
spirits.
Yeah.
Well, we're Canadians, right? It's hard to
like,
avoid.
Pretty much born with them on.
I had a dream last night that I was on playing hockey again. And I'm like, if I'm having dreams, it's been too long since I was on the rink.
100%.
Yeah. I was just on the pond the other day with my son. My son Thomas is 3. We have a little pond in the woods behind our house. So we go down on it.
Yeah,
And he's
nice.
still a little young to play, but we have high banks. And I'm like, this is going to be perfect. I don't have to chase the pucks when I'm teaching you how to
Right.
play hockey.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I put in my yearbook
Yeah.
for the 12th grade that in 10 years I'd be the author of at least one book.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew I wanted to write books even in high school.
So
but
you wrote it down.
yeah, I
So
did.
you wrote it down and it ended up happening. You know, you hear people say that. You hear people say, write down what your goals are, write down you want to be. But this is an example of you doing this and it actually working. more or less.
Again, I was lucky. I say I had a head start because I
Yeah.
already figured out what I wanted to do when I was 13 years old. Most people now, you have to spend like half your 20s or even into your 30s before you really figure out what you want to do with your life.
What I do didn't even exist. I want to be a YouTube filmmaker. Like it didn't even, what would I have even gone to school for to be that?
That's
really,
true. But I
right?
mean, if you're into the outdoors,
Yeah.
you have a head start. But I knew I wanted to make my career from the wilderness.
Yeah.
When I got to the 10th grade, you're like 15 and they make you do career studies. I told my teacher, I was like, Miss Chuddick, I just want to live in the wilderness. And she said, that's not a career, Adam. You have to pick something.
Oh yeah.
So I was like, the assignment for the class was you had to interview
Yeah.
a professional and do your report on it. So I
Right.
was like, well, I want a job that's in the wilderness. So I actually interviewed a park ranger because I was like, I want something that pays you to live in the forest. So I interviewed a Ministry of Natural Resources employee. And I was thinking like, maybe I'll do that. And I just thought writing was like a passion on the side. I never really thought you'd be able to earn a living from writing books. But I liked books enough that I would always want to write them.
Right.
Even if nobody read them, that wouldn't
Yeah.
really change the playing field for me. I would just
Yeah.
write them as passion projects. The fact that some people anyways, read my books is, I can't be more grateful than that, right?
They're available on audio as well too, which is great. Which is a great way to consume stuff when you drive around. You don't get the same experience because it's easier to miss stuff. I find when you're listening to audiobooks than when you're actually like. I'm the kind of reader. I'm not a fast reader, but I'm the kind of reader. I don't flip the page until I know exactly what was going on there.
Yeah, I
You know
read
what
slow
mean?
as well. Despite the fact that I read
Yeah.
a lot, I like to read slow. I really like to savor each page and sort of like think, oh, what was the writer doing here in this paragraph? And sometimes I'll reread a paragraph twice or even
Right.
3 times to really absorb it.
Right.
But audiobooks are great. I mean, they're very convenient if you're driving to work
Yes,
or you're
yeah.
doing work around the house. It's good. And they have advantages
Just
as well.
trying to cancel out your children screaming.
Exactly.
You know.
I think in Alone Against the North, I put a lot of humor into that book.
Yeah.
Like irony and sarcasm, which sometimes didn't always come across on the printed page. So people didn't really get what I was going for. But if you listen to the audiobook, it's like
When
you
you're
can
telling
pick
it.
up. Yeah, you can pick up, oh, okay, he's being tongue in cheek. This is supposed to be funny, what
Yeah.
he's describing.
Amazing.
So yeah, there are advantages to the audiobook as well.
Yeah. And so you essentially you knew you wanted to do something with the wilderness that had to do with the wilderness. You knew that you loved writing, and then so it slowly kind of became more or less your livelihood
Yes.
going into that.
Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty awesome, man.
Well, I think in my 20s I would write all kinds of things. Like I was writing so much in my 20s, academic articles on history, newspaper columns on nature and environmental issues. I'd write, just fictional stories set in the 1700s or
Right.
medieval times for fun.
Right.
But I didn't know if any of those would ever be published. I think I would send things to publishers, like make a query, and you'd always get rejection letters. And I thought, one day it'll work out. I don't know exactly how. But I was lucky where I just focused more on my adventures, doing my expeditions. I was doing things for the Royal Canadian Geographical Society.
Yeah.
And the pieces of the puzzles just sort of came together. And that was my mindset, which was like, never give up. When in doubt, just keep going, keep pushing on. Something will turn up. And that's the same mindset I have on a 3,400 kilometer wilderness journey, right? It's getting dark. I don't know where to camp. Should I just stop here and sleep on this rock? It's not going to be very pleasant. Or should I push on? And I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to push on. Something will turn up.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my mindset in life as well as in the wilderness on a journey.
It's funny how those two things are definitely similar. You know what I mean? Don't give up, keep going bit by bit. Don't get discouraged. Exact same sort of thing to finish a massive wilderness expedition as to become an author.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know if you do this, but when I'm in the wilderness on a solo journey,
Yeah.
I mean, it's ironic. It sounds like a paradox, but to be an optimist, before I go to bed or when I wake up in the morning, I always think, what's the worst case scenario?
Right.
So when I wake up in the morning, I'm like, okay, a bear definitely ate all my food in the night. my canoe probably blew away in that storm, which can happen, as you know.
Once in 18 years, it happened to me.
And it's going to be like gale force, 70 kilometer an hour wind gusts. Temperatures will be hovering around freezing, heavy rain, nowhere to camp. But by the law of averages, the balance of probability is a bear didn't eat your stuff. So when you unzip the door and look out and your food barrel's still there, it's like, this day is starting off on a high. Everything is going my way, right? And it's like, maybe the weather's not that great, but I have my food here. And how can you complain when you just had this lovely granola bar for breakfast?
Which you love, the granola bars. You find them very relaxing.
Well, it's the same sort of thing, right? After a month, everything starts to taste good.
Tastes amazing.
So it's like, man, I'm craving that freeze-dried meal.
Cool.
So I always try to find ways to look on the bright side, because I think a lot of people, when they do sort of like a daunting journey, it's not the physical side that defeats them, it's the mental side, where they take themselves out of the game before it's even began, because they end up worrying about too many things. And I just sort of break it down and say, what do I have to be grateful about for this day? And it's like, well, the wind is awful, just gale force winds. This is going to be like snail's pace all day, just inching into these headwinds, but there's no bugs. The wind is so strong, there's no mosquitoes and black flies. I don't have to wear a mesh bug net. It's so liberating now just to have my head free to breathe in that air. And then like the next day, it's dead calm. There's no wind whatsoever. The black flies are atrocious.
Horrific.
You're getting eaten alive. It's like, I just donated, a liter of blood for those black flies and mosquitoes. But it's dead calm. And I'm just canoeing along, making 5-6 kilometer an hour progress now. That's amazing.
And the bugs are making you paddle faster.
So it's like, there's so many, every drawback kind of has a positive as well. And I would always look on those scenarios. Like, it's just constant. It's been 2 weeks straight of rain. This is awful. I'm soaking wet. My feet are looking bad. But on the bright side, there's no danger of forest fires right now. This heavy rain system for the last 2 weeks has soaked the forest and eliminated forest fire hazards, which is definitely a positive in this scenario. So any of those scenarios, I always try to find some sort of upside, right? Like, now it's going to be slow going. I got a portage, but it's going to keep me warm, so I don't have to worry about hypothermia. I do all these sorts of scenarios to try to stay motivated, stay upbeat, stay optimistic.
Absolutely. And you talk about that in your book, and it's almost kind of comical sometimes, because things can seem so bad, but you're like, but at least the wind is at my back, despite the fact that there's 10-foot rollers on the lake or something like that. And it's almost like you bring it up in kind of a way that's funny, but also is just very realistic, because you can see how that keeps kind of motivating you and pushing you on and getting you to think positive. Like, I can, it's a little bit counter wisdom too, to wake up and be like, worst thing that happens, bear ate my tent. I look down, my leg's been ripped off and all my food's gone or whatever, and get out. And it's almost like when you get out, you're sort of like actually thinking negatively, but then you get out there and nothing could be worse than a worst case scenario. But then how you're actually focusing on the positive despite how bad things are. It's really interesting. And of all places where you can talk about good weather, horrific bugs, bad weather, not good bugs, like, you can't win in Labrador.
No.
Right? It's just like you're getting killed. On the nicer the day, the more just absolutely riddled you get with black fly bites. And the worse the day, you're freezing, but there's no bug. It's like you both things do not exist. And
but you try to make the positive or the best out of whichever scenario you end up in, right?
What do you prefer? Bad weather, no bugs, or good weather and bugs?
That's a tough one. It's
right.
It's actually the combination that works well, right?
Yeah.
If it's cold, I don't mind cold. So I do a lot of journeys late in the year in September. And then there's no bugs, which is definitely a bonus. But if you have like really bad headwinds every single day, you're not going to be doing very long journeys.
No.
You're just going to be covering like 10K a day or something like that. So you kind of need both, right? Whether it's bad black flies or mosquitoes, you just sort of make the best of it, whatever scenario you're in. Same with the portages. I'm sure you can relate to this. When you know you have some long, grueling portage coming up, it could be like 4 kilometers. I just tell myself ahead of time, before I've even taken a look at it, it's going to be like impenetrable deadfall every which way, broken branches, tear my clothes to shreds, poke an eye out. And then it's like, it's only 1 kilometer of impenetrable deadfall. After that, it kind of opens up and it's not so bad. So because you told yourself ahead of time it's going to be 4 kilometers of deadfall and it only turns out to be 1, psychologically, it feels like it's all downhill, like you're ahead of the game. Whereas if you're coming into that portage and you're thinking, it's going to be pretty open, I'll probably get this done before lunch. And then you realize, it's going to take 2 days to get through this. I mean, it's just such a crushing blow mentally, because you weren't expecting it.
100%.
It can take you like right out of the game. before you even began.
Yeah.
So I try to avoid those mental pitfalls
Right.
by prepping myself psychologically, like
Yeah.
ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
It's
And
gonna be hard.
that's come from experience, I imagine, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
same in hockey. To use a hockey
Yeah.
example, coaches try to tell their team, like,
Yeah.
don't get overconfident. If you think you're just going to have a cakewalk and win this series in 4 games,
Yeah.
this team's a lot better than you realize. Because sometimes, that can be a pitfall as well if you think
Yeah.
it's going to be too easy.
Then you're not playing good and you take the other team too lightly and you get your butt kicked.
Yeah. So I always try
Yeah.
to tell myself, this set of rapids is going to be really bad. And, get in the zone now, or we're going to have to portage here, right? To
Yeah.
prepare for it. And then it turns out,
Absolutely.
no, these rapids aren't that bad. We don't actually have to portage. It's like, wow, we just won the lottery.
Right.
Instead of spending the next 6 hours grueling through that portage,
Yeah.
we're just going to get through this in 10 minutes down through this set of rapids, right? So I
Amazing
do that
feeling.
kind of stuff as well. Yeah, it is a great feeling whenever
Mm-hmm.
that happens on a journey.
Totally. And I think what people kind of don't realize is that it's so much more than a number of miles or kilometers, right? Like everybody wants to hear how many miles did you travel? And especially when it comes to portaging, you could have a portage that's, 4 or 5 kilometers long, or you could have one that's 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers long. That's way harder. You look at some of these long portages in Algonquin Park, they're maintained, they're used all the time. They're like highways. Feels like a piece of cake. But then you get in somewhere like Labrador where there's no portage trails, where you're in mountainous, rugged country and you're like hauling your canoe through the bush and, trying to go through impenetrable alder bushes. I remember one portage we were doing in Labrador, and we had to stand our canoe up straight on its end, 17-foot canoe, and like twist it through these like this cliff and these trees. And it's like even hard to explain, right?
Oh, I know that exact feeling
Yeah.
where you're like, I always
Yeah.
think of it like a game of Twister.
Yeah.
Where you're
Yeah.
flipping a canoe on its side, trying to edge between black spruce, then turn it this way,
Yeah.
go back to the bow, bend it that way, now go to the stern, angle it this way. Like the forest
Yeah.
can be so thick. But I think that is the crucial fact that some people who maybe haven't done, deep wilderness, the absence of trails is really like night and day.
Yes.
If you're traveling on an established trail, everything is just so much easier. I mean, mentally, you can just kind of zone out because you're just putting one foot in front of the other. You don't have to worry about getting lost, and you don't have to worry about poking your eye out or tripping over this deadfall.
Crevices.
Yeah.
With like a little moss over them, like in Labrador. Sometimes I think you ran into some of those things where you step in the wrong spot. It's like a leg breaker. Your leg just goes down into a cavern.
There's a lot of those in Nunavut and
Yeah.
the Northwest Territories as well. Like on the Arctic tundra, there are some areas where it's just desolate rock as far as the eye can see, riddled with boulders. And it's like perfect for either slipping and smashing your head off a rock or twisting an ankle. And you have to portage across this boulder field, just this chaotic jumble of rocks every which way. And I mean, half the time I'd be weaving between them. Other times I'd be trying to balance on top of them. And that can go on for miles. I think, that is probably the biggest factor, the lack of trails that makes things so much more difficult. That's what I tell myself when I was portaging around Niagara Falls.
Yeah.
I was like, well, it's 13 kilometers to get around Niagara Falls, the Whirlpool Rapids, the gorge, before I can put back in below the Queenston-Lewiston Bridge.
Yeah.
But I'm like, there's a paved trail the whole way.
Portage Avenue.
It's paved trail. Yeah, it's easy.
Yeah, it just goes to show how things progress over time. At one time was a portage trail, and now it's a road that goes past casinos.
Yeah, absolutely. It's still called the Portage Road at one
Right.
point, but that definitely makes it so much easier if you have a trail to follow in any sort of environment, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Do you ever get other historians that call you and something that you kind of discovered that you thought was interesting, they can link it to a bigger story?
Well, I collaborate with different archaeologists and historians all the time. I was having a fascinating conversation last week with an archaeologist working on Baffin Island in the Arctic, planning to go there this summer. I can't say all of the things she just found up there, but no, I mean, like many fields of human endeavor, it's all collaborative. You build off of the groundwork someone laid before you. You stand on their shoulders. This happens all the time in historical research. You spend a lot of time just reading what other people have done, and then you say, okay, based off of Wallace and the field work she did in the 70s, I'm going to use that as my starting point, pick up the breadcrumb trail she left, and try to build off of that. So
Interesting.
I think that definitely happens. I think probably that's happened with some of my books, like A History Canon and 10 Maps. Broke some new ground on different explorers, and other people have now picked up that trail and carried it on.
Yeah.
And it's like that in many different areas, right? Not just in history and archaeology.
Yeah.
where you're building off of someone's work that came before you, or collaborating, or you read someone's work and it totally changed your perspective, or a new idea popped into your head. I didn't think of this.
Yeah.
What a good insight, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's part of the fun of it as well.
Yeah. I imagine you found some, because in the Arctic, there's all kinds of, undocumented kind of historical sites that some of them, might not even be that old really, but Inuit tent rings and, stone fox traps and all kinds of stuff, old meat caches and things like that. I found a ton of those things too, but I think, which I'm sure you've probably seen a few of that kind of thing. They're usually closer to the coast.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very,
Yeah.
Inuit culture historically, even today, was very maritime, right?
Yeah.
Coastal oriented.
Yeah.
Main
Except for
food
the
staples.
Kazan, maybe.
Yeah,
Yeah,
a little bit
yeah.
there. That's the only inland community even
Right.
now, right?
Yeah.
Everywhere else is based around seals,
Yeah,
fish,
yeah.
and whales. Coastal villages, coastal settlements. But I mean, yeah, you think of France or Germany.
Yeah.
Archaeologists are still making new discoveries there all the time in
Right.
2024.
Yeah.
Well, France and Germany could fit into like a little corner of Ontario.
Right.
I mean, think of how vast Canada is.
Yeah.
I mean, Newfoundland is closer to Ireland than it is to British Columbia.
Right.
The
right.
Atlantic Ocean.
I never even thought about that, but absolutely.
Yeah, if you're in Eastern Canada, you're closer to Spain and Ireland than you are to Western Canada. I mean, so it's just so vast. And as you know, when you go out there, I mean, it really impresses on you how vast that landscape is. And you could be looking for a needle in a haystack, but in this case, it's like looking for a needle in an entire farmstead, right? It could be anywhere out there. So little things will come to light even centuries from now.
Yeah.
There's so many expeditions from the past. Lost explorer vanished. I'm doing a project right now about a lost explorer who vanished in 1910. So
Okay,
half the time I'm in the archives looking through old letters,
Right.
going down rabbit holes in archives saying, I think this guy might have been in the area. He wrote letters in 1907, could shed light on this. And then going back out into the wilderness and trying to retrace a route, thinking, I think this is where this trapper was in
Interesting.
1908. There could be a
Interesting.
cabin here.
Sounds like a book. in
Yeah,
the
that could
making.
be a book a couple years
Yeah.
from now. This is a lost explorer I've been researching off and on since 2011.
Yeah.
So it's taken a long time to pick up all those breadcrumb trails and put the threads together
Yeah.
and sort of tell his story. I want to write a book about him
Yeah.
and his disappearance.
Interesting. What area?
This is Northwest Territories, Western Arctic, not far from the Beaufort Sea.
Cool. Yeah. My brother and I found a stone cairn that was likely built by Collinson and McClure. We think when Captain Robert McClure made first contact with a group of Copper Inuit on Western Victoria Island in his journals, because that's right where this cairn was. And we don't know what's in it, but McClure writes how he gave this Inuit girl a pen and paper, and she drew what at the time was the best map of the Arctic coast known to the British Empire, and also drew Victoria Island, which at that time they called Victoria Land.
Yeah.
And so that was the first time they knew that Victoria Island was, in fact, an island. Now, there's no mention of building a stone cairn there, but what an interesting thing to leave in a little metal jar or whatever they're called and put it in the cairn. But he didn't mention the cairn. So we documented this with the Canadian Museum of History. It's called Site OFPT10. And they had somehow bypassed it. They're up in the area looking for everything as part of the search for Franklin, but somehow they didn't see it. And my brother and I just stumbled across it because we were likely traveling by similar means. Now they actually walked along the coast, hauling sledges, right? We were paddling, but it's funny because probably a natural place to stop, whether it's soft water or hard water, would be in that spot, and likely where other Inuit people would be encamped, where they would stop to meet them, would be in a spot like that. So I just find it interesting that oftentimes traveling the way that we do, which is the same way that people did travel, you happen to come across these things, and whether or not you even realize it, you're kind of in the footsteps of people who once passed that way before, in the footsteps of history. And it's just such a fascinating feeling.
Oh, absolutely.
Don't you think?
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I mean, there's hundreds of cairns
Yeah.
like that scattered
Yeah.
across the Arctic
Yeah.
archipelago and
Yeah.
all over North America. There are sites like that you think like, oh, they must have been documented
Right.
back in 1993. But it's
Yeah.
like, no, it's so easy to
Yeah.
miss.
Yeah.
Like petroglyphs and things that you could walk by 1,000 times and never see it unless
Right.
the sun was hitting it just right.
Right.
You wouldn't notice it
Well,
was
because
ever
they're
there.
like 3,000 years old. Some of the
Some of them are,
pictographs. And
very
that.
heavily faded. And
Yeah.
if the light isn't just right, you're not going to see it there. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, those kind of finds are always extremely exciting, and there's many of them that are still just waiting to be found out there. All kinds of mysterious cairns in the high Arctic.
Yeah, it's just part of the whole kind of adventure. Have you ever done much tripping in Temagami region at all?
Oh yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah.
I used to do guided hikes in Temagami.
Oh, okay.
On foot,
Yeah.
teaching people how to identify wild mushrooms.
Oh, neat.
Yeah, but Temagami, one of the most beautiful areas of Ontario for sure.
I should ask you about this. Actually, it kind of is similar to what we're talking about before on, you creating a book or some content and then some other historian or other person seeing what you've done and then relating it to something they did. But it was, we were there with Indigenous elder Alex Matthias, who lives on Obabaca Lake, and he was showing us some of these old pictographs. And he said, I don't know how old they are. My dad told me they weren't from our people, but I think about 3,500 years old or something like that. And, made in red ochre. A guy called me from the Kirk Whipper Canoe Center, and he'd been studying the travels of the Iroquois that were killed at Iroquois Falls.
Yes, yeah.
And they were apparently guided by the Dokis Ojibwe. And so he thinks that there's a good chance those pictographs were made by those Iroquois that were being guided by the Dokis Ojibwe that ended up being killed at Iroquois Falls, which to me sounds super cool. Whether it's true or not, I have no idea. But he was like ecstatic because he saw this video we shot with Alex on these things. I don't know if you have any idea whether something like that would be possible.
Well, it's very hard to date
Yeah.
pictographs. I did more research on petroglyphs when I was studying for my PhD. Pictographs are paintings on the rock. We don't have very many petroglyphs in Ontario, which is an actual rock carving.
Right.
There's only one really famous petroglyph site, Petroglyph Provincial Park. But in Western Canada, there's thousands of petroglyphs, which are rock carvings. And there were many different methods to try to figure out how to date them. One of which was actually excavating at the base of the stone, digging down through the layers of soil, and finding the actual shavings from the rock that had been chiseled out maybe 1,000 years ago. And then hopefully finding something organic that you could date, like carbon, and then carbon dating the shavings. An archaeologist tried to experiment with that technique. Other times, petroglyphs will come to light where they've been buried underground for like 2,000 years or more, and you have like a storm, and it uproots a tree, and it brings up all this earth. And it's like this thing was 3 feet underground or more, and it was hidden there. But if you go back in time 3,000 years ago, this might have been exposed here, or water levels were different. Other petroglyphs are underwater along the coast, and it's like the water levels have changed. And 900 years ago, that was 10 feet up the shore. Now it's under the water. But yeah, it's very difficult to date those things or prove it. But I mean,
because it's just rock. How do you date it and know when it was?
Yeah, it's very
made?
difficult to do. But I mean, it's fascinating. People study, pictographs and petroglyphs, they come to light all over the world, all over the northern hemisphere.
So many similarities between them too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Many people, researchers have been attracted to that. Like, why are these petroglyphs on, say, the coast of British Columbia so similar to the ones that you see in Southeast Asia? Or how come these ones in the Arctic look so similar to the ones in Scandinavia? Is it just different cultures all over the world have certain cultural archetypes? Same stories, same patterns seem to come up in myths all over the world. Does it reflect something deep in the human psyche? Or are they possible indications of ancient journeys and ancient connections? People have explored that theory.
Let your mind run wild, right?
Exactly. So anytime you can connect a story, whether it's the story of Iroquois Falls with particular pictographs in Temagami, it's fascinating. I can't speak specifically on those ones. It'd be really cool if that turns out to be the case. But sometimes, the story in itself is sometimes, it has a value in itself, whether it's true or false. Folklore and legends, they have a certain truth to them, even if it didn't actually happen that way. Sometimes there's a hidden truth within like the story of the
every good story deserves embellishment. Is that another Gandalf quote? What the hell is with me today? Jeez. But that's that you have this background in archaeology in general as well, right? Was that did that spawn out of your passion for nature and travel like that? Do you find those things to be one of the same in some way or another?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
the kind of historical research that I'm interested in
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes hand in glove with what I do in wilderness canoe
Mm-hmm.
journeys. So I'm interested in indigenous history, fur trade history,
Right.
early explorers, historical
Yeah.
geography, and remote history, places out in the wilderness, in the Arctic or the subarctic or the boreal forest. So yeah, to me, it's all interconnected. And they complement each other fairly well. I like, in all of my books, this is something I try to do, Where the Falcon Flies Beyond the Trees, weaving the history of the places I'm traveling through
Yeah.
into my story. So it's not just the story of my canoe journey in 2022. If I come across the ruins of a cabin or an old grave site or a waterfall with a particular story from 200 years ago connected with it, I try to like weave that into the story of my book. So as you said,
Like the Douglas's cabin, for example, on Great Bear.
yes, yeah,
I believe, or was that Great Bear? Yeah, you also
just up
passed
from Great Bear, yeah,
Great,
you're right.
and you also passed John Hornby's, where John Hornby's cabin was, where he died.
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah, yeah.
And there, I mean, there are places like that all through my northern books, but even as you said earlier on in the podcast on Lake Erie, I tried to have the same approach. I'm like, if I'm
Right.
traveling through Toronto,
Yeah.
you know, there are little hidden gems of history that go back deep in Toronto. Here's the Toronto Islands. This is the reason for the city's existence.
Davenport Road.
Exactly. All these kind of things. Here's an old cemetery, or here's an old lighthouse. I'm going to have to stop my canoe journey and get on this island on the St. Lawrence and find out what this lighthouse is. Well, oh, it dates back 200 years, or this is an old flour mill, 400 years old, oldest flour mill in Canada. Anything that I saw on my journey, I kind of wanted to describe in my book with sort of the idea that if you were to redo this journey, this is sort of like a traveler's log of what you would see
Right.
off the coast of Burlington or Oakville or Trois-Rivières as you did the journey. You know, look out
Right.
for this little spot. Stop
Yeah.
here because there's
Oh,
a manor in the
absolutely.
woods. If you stop at this creek and you go up it, you can glimpse this old French manor from the early 1700s.
What
at this spot.
amazing like scavenger hunt that would even be for students or something like that, eh? To where you could build a whole curriculum off of that. Almost.
Well, you could, and I think you could do that anywhere in the world, right? Anywhere you go out looking, you're going to find all kinds of interesting things.
I was jealous at first because when you first came onto my radar when we were talking about on the Again River when you discovered the waterfall and they're calling you the Canadian Indiana Jones. And it all just makes so much sense to me now because the adventure, the archaeology, you know, sure, you're not beating up Nazis, but I don't know, maybe you are, you're just not talking about
No,
it.
I don't. No whip, no gun. I don't do anything like that.
No, but I mean, it's just it's really cool because there is, I can just see all those things tied together in between your canoe travel, between the history, and between the passion for archaeology as well. How kind of those things just sort of come together as one sort of overarching sort of passion for you, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there was a point in my life where I thought I
Yeah.
was going to end up in a university just as a professor
Right.
when I was doing my PhD, but I still had this abiding passion for the wilderness and for
Right.
like more of an unconventional approach, traveling through the wild. And I thought, well, if I was a professor, you know, I'd have to teach for the semester for 8 months, and then I could go in the wilderness for the summer.
True.
But I was like, man,
True.
I don't know if I could do it. You know,
Yeah.
grading term papers, I'd rather be out in the wild. And so far, I've been lucky enough that I've been able to earn my living just self-employed as an
Yeah.
adventurer, writing books.
Yeah.
And for as long as I'm able to keep doing this, I intend to
Yeah.
just keep doing this route. But I would like to do more history books, and I have plans to do more sort of pure history archaeology books in the years ahead. With maybe a little bit of adventure tossed in just to spice things up. But
Well, the history of Canada in 10 maps, that one is a pure history book. That wasn't based around an expedition, right?
yeah, of my 5 books, that's the only one that's just a pure standalone history book.
Yeah.
That's not an adventure book. But I wrote it as an adventure story. It's just not my story. I put you in the
Right.
shoes or the moccasins of David Thompson and Alexander Mackenzie and Samuel Hearn. I tried to bring their stories to life.
Yeah.
Doing archival research, reading through their journals and their diaries and being like, oh man, I can't believe Alexander Mackenzie wrote this on April 4th, 1789. I've got to give my readers a taste of this. So I'm going to transcribe this from his journal and put it in my book and describe the scene as they're going up the Peace River here. I mean, it's amazing. The ice is breaking up. They're going into these Rocky Mountains. They have no idea where they're going to end up.
Right.
I mean, it's just fascinating.
That's David Thompson you're talking
Alexander
about?
Mackenzie in that case, but
oh,
David
Mackenzie,
Thompson,
a ginger.
yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
Alexander
We gotta
Mackenzie's
stick
one of my
together.
favorites. Yeah.
Well, you like to, you're cool with the gingers. That's all right. That's all
Yeah,
right.
no, Alexander Mackenzie's one of the all-time greats.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a chapter on David Thompson as well. Yeah, so.
That's the one where Mackenzie, he climbed up to the height of land, and there just happened to be like a native dude sitting up there that pointed in his right direction to find the Fraser or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
that's later on.
Yeah,
Like they're in the interior in the mountains
Right.
there, and it's getting to the point where Mackenzie has to kind of decide: do we still keep going by birch bark canoe? Because every day in his diary, he's writing, we have to repair these canoes, and there's fewer and fewer birch trees that are suitable for it.
Right.
He's like, the voyageurs are spending hours just hiking through the woods trying to find a birch tree big enough to make a patch for our canoe, because the mountain rivers are getting just completely wild, choked with white water.
Yeah.
So he's like saying, what do we do? Do we actually abandon our canoes? Which to these voyageurs is almost unthinkable.
Right.
These guys
Yeah.
like canoes
It's
is
a
the air
lifeline.
they breathe. It's what they've done their whole life.
Yeah.
So they're like almost like they have like a phobia of almost abandoning their canoes. But when Mackenzie gets into the interior, they're getting closer to the coast, so it's getting more populated. They're coming across different indigenous nations who have trails, and one of them tells them, and of course they don't understand the language. Mackenzie actually had quite a knack for languages. His first language was Gaelic. He grew up on the island of Lewis, so Gaelic was his first language. He doesn't learn English until later on. He actually is an orphan. He gets sent to the 13 colonies as a little 12-year-old boy, and he learns English there. And then he gets sent to Montreal, which at that time is like a village in the wilderness.
Yeah.
And he gets apprenticed to the fur trade as a kid. So he has to learn French to go work in this fur trade. So he's now trilingual, speaking Gaelic, English, and French.
Wow.
And as a teenager, he gets sent to the Northwest. And with his facility for language, he ends up learning Athabascan, which is the Dene language. And he learns a couple of different Algonquian dialects as well, spoken by the Cree and the Ojibwe.
Oh,
and in his journal, he's writing out, like, basically, this word means kettle. This means axe, trying to figure out this stuff. But he still doesn't really understand the language up in the mountains. But basically through sign language, through pointing at stuff, he realizes, okay, we can go this way and we'll hit the ocean. Canoes are no longer any use to us here. So he says, we're abandoning the canoes, guys.
Yeah.
We're going to travel on foot. And his men are like, oh no, like we're abandoning the canoes.
Yeah,
And he's like, we have to, like we have to go this way. So they travel on foot the rest of the way until they get to the coast, and they come across some of the Pacific Northwest indigenous people who don't have birch bark. They have actual dugout canoes, entirely different technology.
Yeah, not the easiest to portage.
No, and they'll actually go down to the salt water in one of these dugout canoes. And Mackenzie pays these guys a very high compliment. He says they're the most skilled paddlers he'd ever seen, even better than the French Canadian voyageurs.
Wow.
Which is
Did
high
he say
praise
that
indeed.
while the voyageurs were listening to him?
Well, the voyageurs were illiterate, so they weren't going to read his journal.
Right.
They couldn't take a little peek at it around the campfire at night and be like, "Hey, you hurt my feelings."
Right.
But that's what Mackenzie wrote, and of course, paddling on the ocean demands an entirely different skill set with tides. And the tides on the west coast can be very powerful around some of those inlets and things like that. And these are big canoes, not like the kind of canoes we paddle nowadays. And some of these west coast canoes could hold up to 100 warriors.
Were they that big?
Well, they could be, yeah, absolutely.
War canoes you hear called a lot. I'm me thinking maybe 30 people, but 100.
Oh yeah, the massive ones. I mean, you look at the distance they were paddling to some of the offshore islands.
Yeah, like
It's like-
Haida Gwaii.
Exactly, that's a far way offshore.
Yeah,
I mean, you wouldn't want a canoe there nowadays, right?
Islands at the edge of the earth.
Exactly.
means,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. So I mean, you think, how do you even get out there?
Right.
That's very
Gotta have
remote.
a big boat.
Yeah, very big boat, and you want to know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Storm picks up. I mean, you're in a bad spot very quickly. But I mean, yeah, this kind of history is all part of the story. It's fascinating. I'd love to come back to it and revisit it, and maybe write more books about it.
Absolutely.
In the years
looking
ahead.
forward to more books. Is there anything, if you're, let's say you really want to become a writer, is there any advice you would give to, maybe someone younger, maybe someone older that wants to get into writing? What would you recommend they do to try to start?
Well, the two most practical tips I could offer would be to read as much as you can and as widely as you can. I like to read the old classics myself, but I read as many different genres. I mean, you keep bringing up Lord of the Rings, so
I've never even read one of the Lord of the Ring books, but
I actually read Lord of the Rings on my journey across the Arctic. I'd never read them before. I was in my 30s, and I was like, I got to see what the fuss is about. So I read the trilogy on that journey.
Yeah.
I was late to the party, but I got into them. And I could see if you like wilderness, you would like them.
Well, it's
In
it's
the-
all about an expedition. The only thing is, when we do our trips, we're not trying to throw the ring into the fires of Mordor. We don't
No.
have it nearly as good as a hook.
No.
But in fantasy, you can make up anything. But yeah, they're doing canoe trips, they're hiking, they're trekking. It is an adventure,
And
wilderness
the books
adventure.
actually have a lot more of that wilderness camping
Yes.
content than the films showed,
okay,
especially the
yeah.
second and the third one.
Yeah.
There's a lot more of just camping in the forest than made it into the film versions.
Yeah.
But I would say my best advice would be to read as widely as possible because I think that's a great way to sharpen your own skills, your own writing. And then when you write, read it over not once or twice, proofread, but read it 100 times so you almost know your own book off by heart. Because I will write my books fast, but then I'll revise them and just figuring out, well, what word do I really want here, and be really meticulous in terms of structuring the sentence and going over it and just making sure it all flows smoothly. So revision is key, and reading as many different authors. I mean, it's like having different conversations with different people.
Yeah.
And each one of them will hopefully make you a better writer in yourself.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So just start doing it really in a way. It was what you're talking about. Read, start putting pen to paper.
Yeah, you have to take the
I'm
bull by
asking
the
for
horns.
me because like people are like, why haven't you written a book yet? I'm like, I don't know. I'm doing all these videos. I'm doing a podcast now, man. It takes time. Like reading your own book 100 times. Like that's not something you can just bang off in an afternoon,
It gets
You gotta
easier
be
by like the 57th time.
Yeah.
You're sort of just skimming
Yeah, I
it.
guess.
You
Yeah.
know these words.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes you have to revise it a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the key. And some of my books would have been better if I hadn't written them so fast.
Right.
I write a book almost every 2 years, and I have to write them under pretty tight deadlines. So it's like if I had more time, could I have made that book better?
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I still try to read them and write them as many times as possible.
But being a perfectionist is overrated too,
Well, I'm not a
I've been
perfectionist,
wanted to
no.
start this podcast like 2 years ago. I was talking about it. I had to get it all perfect, and I should have just jumped into it further, right? Like sooner. But maybe that's not really what you're saying, though.
No, I wouldn't say I'm a perfectionist. I mean, if you're a perfectionist, you're never going to get anything done.
Right.
You
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you just have to say that I gave it my best shot,
Yeah.
and that's it. The buzzer's gone off, the 60
Right.
minutes is up, the game's over.
Yeah.
So it does help to have a deadline and say, by March 1st, I want to have written 10,000 words of this book. So now I have that deadline. I have to get it done. And sometimes you just have to throw words on the paper
Yeah.
and do that. But that's kind of the approach I use, right? So to me, I do most of the writing when I'm actually in the wilderness in my journal.
Right. Oh, so you're actually not just making notes; you're actually doing the writing out there.
No, yeah,
That's cool.
I've never been able to write in point
Yeah.
form. I just like to write like full sentences.
Yeah.
So when I'm in the wilderness, I just sort of tell myself I should do. I'm alone. I might as well do as much of the actual book writing here as I can.
Oh, no kidding.
So
So that
those
just makes it so much more authentic.
Well-
Now that I know that, that's awesome.
But if I didn't do
Yeah.
it that way, my books you probably wouldn't. They would be not that good because
Right,
I feel like.
Yeah.
The words flow more naturally when you're actually in the wilderness in the moment.
Ah, okay.
If I just came home with no journal or
Yeah.
just point form and I looked at my computer,
Right.
it'd be like, oh man, I just
Yeah.
spent 5 hours and I typed one sentence.
Yeah.
Whereas when I get home, I take those journals and they're like precious because it's like, this is the book, right? This is the manuscript.
Right.
And then I type them up. And I'll edit them as I'm typing them up for style, and I'll polish them and make them better. But it's still
Yeah.
like that's the raw material, that
Yes.
journal. And sometimes like the paragraphs, I just extract them, and it's like, yep, I don't think I could improve on what I actually wrote
Yeah.
while I was shivering on that lake,
Right.
stormbound
The writing's all like shaking.
in the
and stuff.
interior. Well, sometimes I do have to study my own thing and say, what is that? What's that letter?
cool.
Oh, yes, yeah, that's an
Right.
I. Okay. So I
Yeah.
try to make out what I did. And usually the start of the journal is much neater, and then by the end, it's getting more illegible as I went on. But
I imagine being alone for so long too. I remember when I was on the show alone, one of the things that was helpful, or even when I was on some of my longest solo trip, I think was 36 days. And I was filming on it, being able to talk to the camera was almost like a good for your mental well-being when you're out there, because it's something that kind of put your thoughts out too? Do you find that helps when you're writing, when you're out there to write your thoughts down and keeps you on track and keeps you more sane?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Talking
Yeah.
to the camera is like talking to an audience, so you don't
Right.
feel alone anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll do that too. If I don't have time to write everything down, like during
Yeah.
the day, and there's something critical I have to remember on
Yeah.
Where the Falcon Flies, because I traveled through Southern Ontario, Southern Quebec, I try to remember people's names.
Right.
Like you gave me a ham
I
sandwich.
was amazed that you remembered all those people's names, by the way.
So
I
I'd
was
either
like, wow.
I'd either
Yeah.
whip out my notebook and write
Yeah.
down their name right there in the moment
Yeah.
to make sure I got it right, or if I couldn't because of conditions or whatever, I'd use my GoPro.
Right.
And I would say, it's June 4th, and I really want to remember this for this book. I just want to describe the look of this cemetery on this island off Morrisburg, or I really want to remember the kindness that Eileen did to me. She gave me Tim Hortons right here, right? So I would do that, and then, at that night in my tent, I would write my journal like normal, but I would also say, see GoPro recording for details,
okay.
right? So
okay, just give yourself a little note there, and you'd make a video log of it essentially in real time.
yeah, and I would do
more or
that
less.
too if I just wanted to describe like flora, right?
Right.
Like, what are all these mushrooms here?
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'm going to do like basically a tour on my GoPro, which is just for my own private use, describing all the trees on this portage. So when I go to write this chapter of the book, instead of just saying I portage through the woods, I can say I portage through magnificent shagbark hickory,
Right.
a wonderful old sycamore.
Yeah.
And then I came around that and came to this nice big silver maple. So then
Yeah.
it's like adds a little more color to
Yeah.
the description in the book.
Right.
So I'll use the cameras to sort of supplement the journal notes as well.
Very cool. Was it hard to be away from your family? I somehow missed the fact until starting to read your book that you had kids, because you have two pretty young kids. I noticed just on a 2-week trip when my kid was about the same age as yours, when you left for Labrador, when you on your journey from Where the Falcon Flies, about the same age. And I remember finding that there was a shuttle coming in to my end point, and I'm paddling like 100 kilometers straight through the night to get there so I could get home like 2 days early. That was like a two-week trip. Was it hard for you? Were you missing
Oh,
your
absolutely.
kids?
That's by far the hardest point. I mean,
Yeah.
it's brutal, right?
Yeah.
I have two boys. My oldest, Thomas, is turning 3, and my youngest,
Yeah.
Adrian's only 8 months.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had that mind. Luckily, I thought ahead, which was like, I
Yeah.
don't have kids.
Right.
I don't have a family. I'm not married.
Yeah.
So I shouldn't really leave anything behind. I should push myself as hard as I can now.
Right.
And I did that for my journey across the Arctic, the 4 months,
Yeah.
knowing that it would be so much harder when I had a family.
Yeah.
And indeed it is. I mean, the 3 months I did from Lake Erie to the Arctic was super tough.
Yeah.
And I don't think I would have done it, but my wife is actually the one who pushed me out the door and said,
Yeah.
you have to go.
Yeah. I read
I was
that
like,
whole
well,
part.
I was like, what if I just did a journey
Yeah.
through the Great Lakes and wrote a book about a canoe trip to Kingston? She's like, nobody wants to read about a canoe trip to Kingston. She's like, go to the Arctic and
Yeah.
don't come back until you get there.
Yeah.
So she's the one who motivates me.
Amazing.
And I'm
Yeah.
always like, but a month is so long. I don't think I can go for a month, let alone 3. And she's like, that month, that's nothing, right?
Right.
She's like, so I'm lucky that she's so
Yeah.
independent, but it's definitely like, yes, it's very hard to be away from your kids. But the way that I rationalize it is there's many jobs where people are forced to travel. One of my friends who worked on the railroad.
100%.
Yeah. You work on a mine, you work in the oil fields, you work
Right.
on a ship. You have to travel, and I just see it as my job, right? I have
Traveling
to be-
salesman as well. like,
Exactly. You have
yeah.
to be away. But it makes the time when you're home all the more precious because you cherish every moment. And it's like you don't take it for granted. It's like now that we're together, this is so special. We're going to live every
Right.
moment
Yeah.
that we're together because we have to be away some of the time. And I mean, if I could, I would try to do shorter journeys.
Right.
But it's harder, right? Like
Right.
The Whisper on the Night Wind is a book I wrote about a shorter journey to Labrador. And it's just harder to get the material you need to create a book on a 2 to
On a
3 week
shorter
journey,
journey,
right?
yeah.
And whether or not that, I mean, I said very candidly in the first chapter of Where the Falcon Flies that
Yeah.
shorter journeys do not pay as well.
Right. Right.
And if this is your career, if this is how you support your
Yeah.
family,
Yeah.
I mean, you could quit your job and get another job, maybe. But I mean, this is the reality. But I mean,
It's a good problem to have, eh? Like I have the same issue. Honey, geez, I'm gonna have to get out there and do another month-long fishing trip with my brother.
yeah,
We got to pay the bills. We got another kid on the way, and that's what I did before we had our second kid. I said, well, I better go do a big trip, so I have 24 videos. There's a 25 25-day trip. And I have 24 videos, so I can be home the whole time editing when the baby comes.
Yeah.
And you know, so in a way, it's kind of like awesome, but it is harder to be away. I'm a little. Once I found out you had kids, I was like, oh man, this guy's, you know, because before when you didn't have kids, I'm like, he's doing all these incredible trips. And, you know, more substantial than the ones I was doing. And I'm like, well, he doesn't have kids, so you know, it doesn't count, you know. But now you have kids and you're pulling it off, which, you know, before I had kids, I wouldn't realize how much larger of a thing that is. But also, you're doing it for them now too.
Well,
you know?
and I hope not to have to. I mean, I hope I don't have to do any more long journeys for a long time to come, like until they're done high school. I mean, it can't predict the future. I don't know. But I tell my wife that. I'm like, do you think I could still do a 5,000 kilometer journey when I'm 57?
Yeah.
She's like, no.
Well, I haven't told my son Hudson yet, but when I'm 55, I'm planning on doing like a 2-monther with him. He doesn't know, he's only 2. So when he's like 14, I'm going to try to do like, you know, Mackenzie River, Great Bear Lake, maybe like the Wetzel to like the Coppermine to like the Hood or something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You don't think that's doable at 55 or what?
Oh, no. That you could, well, you could definitely do that. Take inspiration from
so?
Gordie Howe. He played until he was 52, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
No, I mean, you could, I don't know. Nowadays, you could probably do it until your 70s or
Maybe.
80s, right?
Just depends on how broken you're going to be at the end of every day, I suppose, too, right?
You'd have to be more patient, right? You
Yeah.
probably wouldn't cover as many miles in a day.
Right.
But slow and steady, you'd get there eventually. And I think in those terms, like, I don't know, maybe I will end up doing another long journey while my kids are still young.
Yeah. What about a month, 2 month and a half?
Well, I'm going to be away for at least that long this summer.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm planning around 2 months worth of journeys in the Arctic this summer.
Oh,
So
really?
that's
Okay.
rough.
Okay.
But
What you have planned? Are you allowed to talk about it? Is it?
it's actually more archaeology, historical
okay.
research than a journey. And I hope to gather material for another history book.
Yeah.
Probably not for a number of years yet, maybe 2027 publication. But it's big history project that I'm working on. One of them I already mentioned is a lost explorer who vanished without a trace.
Right.
So retracing his route, hopefully writing a biography, bringing his story to life because it's never been published.
Yeah.
And some other early archaeology in the Arctic going back 1,000 years.
That sounds like it'd be a cool show. Like trying to find someone who disappeared in the wilderness.
Yeah, I mean, that
know?
would be maybe a documentary. I don't know at this point.
I was before I left, so I went the exact same route as you did when you went in through the headwaters of the DePaul. So I started at Iron Arm and I did DePaul, then I crossed over the George and over another highland, the Adlatok into the ocean. But as I was crossing over between the DePaul and the George, about 30 kilometers up from the confluence. I didn't want to paddle all the way to the confluence because I had to go back upriver. I found what was good chance some gear by this other couple that had disappeared in there and never came back. And before we left, that we were told, hey, the last people to go through there disappeared. No one found their canoe. Nobody found anything. So keep an eye out if you can see, you know, some of their stuff. I mean, people thought maybe they just went and lived there. People thought, you know, there's all kinds of things. And sure enough, at one of the campsites through there, I found like an old fishing rod and, you know, another couple things that were left there.
What year did they disappear?
I think apparently in the 70s.
Oh, in the 70s.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Apparently it might have been 80s, 70s, 80s. I'm not exactly sure. But it was apparently a couple.
And their bodies were never found?
Nothing. Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing
disappeared.
how often that happens in Canada's wilderness. I mean,
Right.
there's even more recent examples of people disappearing and not being found. It doesn't always make the news. So unless you're in that area, you don't hear the particular story about somebody vanished in these mountains in 2004 and nobody knows, right?
Right.
But yeah, I've heard similar stories in different areas where it's like, somebody disappeared or down that river, the last one to go down in 2008 or 1994 or 1952.
Yeah.
There's many of those stories. Yeah.
Do you find it to be really dangerous? Do you find wilderness travel to be death-defying at every turn?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
I say that all the time to people.
Yeah.
I don't think they believe me. And maybe I'm undermining my own books because I know that obviously people like the element of risk and danger. But I have always maintained that, driving to your house today to do this podcast is probably one of the most dangerous things I'm going to do in 2024.
Right.
But statistically, that is
Yeah.
true, right? I
Yeah.
mean, thousands of people every year in Canada alone are either killed or seriously injured behind the wheel. And with our winter, the risk factor just goes up. When I lived in Sudbury, I'd always say driving Sudbury to Timmins, like I used to do regularly in the winter, was like the riskiest thing I ever did.
So risky.
And you would see cars and trucks off the road all the time, right? All the time. People would get in bad accidents.
Right.
Whereas in the wilderness, partly I do it because I enjoy it. It's relaxing. It's fun. And it's like anything, right? Like, yes, you could die in the wilderness if you're reckless and a daredevil and an adrenaline junkie.
Right.
But they could die behind the wheel on a Monday morning if they're a reckless driver. But if you're calm and careful and you're always taking the safer route, like here's some rapids, I could probably run them. However, I'm alone, so I don't want to risk it. Even if it's a 7-hour delay to portage, I'm going to portage. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I describe that in my book all the time, portaging around rapids
I noticed
that I
you
could
don't
probably run.
You don't dump.
No.
Yeah.
Well,
So I don't dump a lot, but I definitely dump more than you do out there. I notice somehow you do thousands and thousands of kilometers, no dumping. You must have better rational decision making ability than I do.
I come close many times.
Yeah,
I came close on the George.
Yeah.
I came close on the Thelon. But yeah, usually if I'm like, I think these rapids there's a possibility I could flip my canoe or swamp, then I'm not going to risk it because I'm alone. And ultimately I want to live to tell this story.
Right.
So I'm going to portage around. And that's the truth. I mean, I wish more people knew that, which is that actually going in the wilderness doesn't have to be some scary, death-defying thing. Your odds of getting attacked by a bear are very, very low.
Right.
Your odds of something bad happening is really minimal if you're being smart and safe. And I know people probably don't believe that. They're like, but I read your book, you sound crazy. And it's like, well, it only sounds like that because you haven't actually been in the wild with me. I mean, I lead guided hikes every fall, and I've taken hundreds of people, and we've never had a single issue ever.
Yeah.
Not even a twisted ankle.
Right.
But I mean, there are people whose personality, and I have nothing against them, they're daredevils. They love doing huge like jumps on their snowmobile or on their snowboard or what, and it's fine. But it's like, yes, that mindset in the wilderness could result in trouble. And every year, thousands of people need to be rescued. Sometimes in very well-trodden areas, in like Banff National Park, there's like 4 million tourists, and you weren't prepared.
Well, it's more likely to be in those areas. It's not so much that guys that need to get rescued aren't the people with experience that are doing these deep wilderness trips. A lot of the time, it's guys in Banff that went off the trail to have a pee and got turned around, and these kinds of things. Then again, they don't have any supplies. They don't have a lighter on them.
Yeah, or it's even more well-traveled to be like Mount Washington, where like 5 million tourists go a summer in New England. But they set off with like T-shirts and a shorts because it's a day in July, not knowing there could be snow as you get to the top. And it's like, well, you have a T-shirt on. Of course you're going to have to get rescued. But I mean, no, certainly, I mean, being in the wilderness, if you're smart, I mean, I always wear a life jacket.
Right.
So some people don't do that. But if you're wearing a life jacket, you've already greatly eliminated your risk.
Right.
If you're portaging around the worst rapids, you've greatly eliminated your risk.
Right.
Bears. I do all sorts of things to minimize my risk from bears, like not going along the seacoast in the Arctic. If I can at all avoid it where the polar bears are, stay inland where there are no polar bears.
And you bring comms too? You bring like an inReach or a sat phone or something with you?
Most of the time, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think realistically, and I'm sure you can understand this because you've been in that scenario, I think a lot of people who haven't don't realize that that if you were actually in the most plausible scenarios, they would be very little use to you.
They're great for telling people where to find the body.
Exactly. That's pretty much all they're for. Because if you're flipping rapids, it's like, how much time do you have? You have maybe a couple of minutes to right the situation and get your head back up above the waves and get to shore. Otherwise, it's game over. Same with hypothermia. How long are you going to last if you fall in that, the Arctic Ocean?
Right.
I mean, maybe an hour.
Yeah.
If you're lucky, before you lose feeling. I'm being generous.
Right.
And it's like search and rescue, even in rural Ontario, doesn't have an hour response time.
Oh yeah. No, I remember being stuck in a blizzard, one of many, in the middle of the Ungava Peninsula. Ripping wind. Was very hard to get my tent up. And I'm trying to cut the snow block wall to sort of block the wind so I can get the tent up. And after I'm working on this for hours, the wind just changes.
Yeah.
And I'm sweating. If I don't get this tent up, like probably just a little block snow shelter to crawl into isn't going to be enough. And, you know, I had a sat phone or I had an inReach device. And I remember just thinking like, and now I went on a loan the same year because I'm a glutton for punishment. Well, you know, who am I, preaching to the choir? But I remember just thinking like, there's no way that on a loan, even though it was physically extremely hard, that I was ever in that much danger. Like they have people that are going to save you, or, you know, one of the shows, Survivor Man or Bear Grylls and all these kind of like survival shows or things that people are doing, where I was at that moment was like way more dangerous. And we're talking about like minimum like 4 days. Nobody's going to come rescue you in the middle of a blizzard. You have to wait for the blizzard to end. So yeah, this is where the body's going to be, kind of thing, right? So there is an element of danger, but I would agree, like your odds on getting murdered are 1 in 60,000 or something like that. There's been 6 people that have been killed by bears in Ontario in the last, in Ontario in the last 100 and something years. You know what I mean? So I would agree there are dangers, but if you can be wise about them.
Well, there's dangers everywhere, right? There are dangers inside your house.
Yeah.
There are dangers. Anything we do, risk is inherent. So you might as well do what you want, not let fear hold you back, right? That's my philosophy. I was just in Englehart, north of Kirkland Lake.
Yeah.
And I had a couple of paramedics come see me. They liked my books. And I asked them, you're paramedics. So I'm like, what's the jurisdiction you cover?
Yeah.
And what would be your response time to an emergency, a 911? On the far side of your jurisdiction? And they said an hour and a half. It'd take us 90 minutes to get to a person's house.
Right.
And it's like, I think people who live in rural areas or in more remote settings, they know that they have to be a little more self-reliant. Like if you had some injury in your house or you're working with power tools, you've got to stop the bleeding because there's not going to be an ambulance getting to your house in time before you bleed out. And I think some people who live in a place in, say, maybe in a more urban area where the response time, emergency response time is 5 minutes, their mindset is a little bit different where help is only a phone call away.
Yeah.
And I guess if you just live in a more rural area, it's it's a more natural transition to going into the wilderness where it's like, well, again, you know, you can't be bleeding to death for 48 hours. That doesn't work. So if I have an injury, well, first I have to make sure I don't get an injury. When I'm swinging my axe, I need to know exactly where my leg is so I don't hit it.
Right.
Or if I bleed, I mean, I have to have the first aid skills and the equipment to cover up this wound so that I don't bleed to death.
Yeah.
And I mean, that kind of mindset, I mean, it more naturally leads the one to the other. But I think there is a certain mistaken impression that if you're deep in the wilderness and you get into trouble, you just grab your spot and somebody's going to come up around the bend. Even in Banff National Park, one of the most popular national parks in Canada where millions of tourists go every year, as we know, the response time, if you're in the backcountry, can be more than 24 hours before any park rangers actually get to your location.
Right.
So if you're in acute, immediate danger, you are dependent on yourself to get out of that situation with rapids, with drowning, with hypothermia, where the clock is ticking, the sand is running out. You have to be able to get out of that situation, and whether or not you have a satellite phone is irrelevant.
Right.
Because you don't have that big a window of time.
Right.
And if you deal with the situation successfully, well, you've already changed out of your wet clothes. You're into your second pair of dry clothes, which hopefully you stored in your vinyl waterproof bag.
Right.
You've got your fire going in less than 20 minutes. You've got water boiling.
Yeah.
And in the space of about 30 minutes, you went from I'm in a life-threatening situation till I'm perfectly comfortable with my cup of tea around this campfire.
Right.
And I'm ready to go on for another month.
Yeah.
So you have to be ready to like handle that situation in the moment and get yourself out of it. Because if your mindset is, I don't have to worry about it because I have a spot or I have a satellite phone, someone will come and rescue you. That's actually the more reckless scenario where you're more likely to end up now in some sort of tragedy because you were dependent on someone else coming to rescue you when that was never actually in the cards to begin with. So that's, I mean, your story of Ungava, I would agree 100%. I mean, that's the exact scenario you sketched out is the reality on the ground out there.
And so just these things can't be thought of as a false sense of security.
No, if anything, it's going to lull you into a false sense of security and make you take risks that you shouldn't.
Right.
And to be perfectly clear with what I'm saying here, I don't want to make people think I'm saying like, oh, you have to be Rambo. No, I think anyone can go out into the wilderness and have a relaxing time and be in no more danger than they would be on a morning commute.
But have some basic wilderness skills. Just like in the city, you know how to get from point A to point B in your car, know how to get a fire from sticks into flames. You know what I mean? It's not that much more complicated.
And be smart about it, right? Like always take the path of least resistance. Here's a cliff. I saw on TV somebody would climb this cliff. Well, no, that would be very foolhardy. Just go around the cliff on this nice level ground. It'll be faster, easier, and there's no danger.
Well, some of those survival shows, like don't drink your own urine, drink the water. You know what I mean? Some of the survival shows that like glorify things. Guys are going up the cliffs and rappelling down and drinking their own piss.
That would be the worst thing possible to do in a survival scenario. And totally unnecessary. I mean, even with this camera angle, you can see that cliff goes for like 100 meters, and then around it you could just bypass the whole thing.
And I think some of that stuff gets people in trouble because I think it's this like crazy thing, but a lot of the time it's beautiful out there. And actually that's one of the things that's cool about traveling solo, which I've found to be, I like traveling with people too, but I've done a lot of solo trips, and I know you have, is just that sort of time that you get to reflect where there's not a bunch of chaos and portaging and everything. And in fact, it's way more calm and chill than most situations you're going to run into. 99% of situations you're going to run into in society. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. I think some of the people I did expeditions with when I was younger, they fell into that exact pitfall where they were expecting, I'm going into this huge adrenaline surging situation in the wilderness. But when you get out there, you realize it's actually more of a repetitive routine, where you're doing the same exhausting manual labor over and over again, and there is no particularly heart-stopping or scary moment. Maybe there's one every couple of days, and it's over in 5 minutes, when that bear charged you. But the rest of the time, if you don't love the natural world, if you don't love wildlife and plants and wild trees and mushrooms, you're just going to find it boring. And you're like, what am I doing here? I could be on a beach on a resort, or I could be in a bar. I don't need to be here out in the wild. So people actually just want to quit for that reason, because it's actually not an exciting Hollywood movie most of the time. Like most of the time, you're just paddling across a lake, portaging your canoe through the forest. And when you do that long enough, over like months, you get enough exciting moments that you can put it all together to like an incredible epic story, a book or a film or what have you. But in between, there's just a lot of the daily grind, right?
Absolutely. And I think, if you have the wrong expectations, it might not be like you thought it was going to be. But I remember you wrote something like this in your book too, about being solo. And it's something that I've experienced too. It's like you kind of get into almost a meditative state sometimes when you're just going down the river and the weather's half decent and there's no waterfalls up ahead, and you're just kind of making distance, the cadence of your paddle, and it's almost just like thoughts and ideas just kind of come to you that are really fascinating, reflections on different things, philosophies almost that seem to be coming from somewhere else, like they almost seem to be coming from nature that you're not even thinking. It's kind of going like that. And I always notice something like that happening on my longer solo trips. And I mean, no wonder you're able to put pen to paper out there and write such compelling sort of narratives or tell the story so much, because I guess you're kind of experiencing that same sort of thing when you're in nature as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing what you can come up with when you are free of all distractions. I think that's something people struggle with in the modern world, is we're just bombarded by distractions. Like we can't go more than 5 minutes without looking at our phone. Or being like, what happened on Instagram, or what happened on the news? I have to get the latest news. And we have so many distractions even in our day-to-day lives. No matter what walk of life you're in, what career, it can be hard to actually get tasks done, because it's like, I just had another 5 emails come in. And now, that happens constantly.
It's my life story, man.
So when you're in the wilderness, all of these distractions have been eliminated. They're not there. You don't even have to think about it, because they aren't there anyways. You couldn't check your emails even if you wanted to.
Exactly.
So it's amazing what that does to your mind, how now all of a sudden you can focus on one task with 100% clarity and see things from a fresh perspective. And that's kind of like what I was saying, how I get most of my writing done for my books when I'm actually in the wilderness on the journey. I'm free of all distractions. The words are just flowing on the page. I mean, and I'm writing by hand the old-fashioned way in my notebook, so there's not even a temptation to open up a browser or check something out. And I think that that's an experience that, you know, maybe it's not everyone's cup of tea, and I'm not preaching against modern technology. It's all well and good. Everything has its place. But many people could probably benefit from that, just having fewer distractions. I know it's hard to tune those things out, but when you do, it's amazing how much you can get accomplished, right? I mean, it's just like I'm organizing my garage, but it took 3 times as long because I couldn't put my phone down.
Oh my God.
Or something like that, right? Where if you just have no distractions, it's like I'm just plowing through these tasks. It's amazing. And I find it so relaxing just to have no news, no emails, no contact. So again, to come back to what we were talking about earlier with risk, people say, oh man, it must be so stressful doing what you're doing.
Right.
But the secret is actually, it's like, no, what you're doing is very stressful. I'm lucky I have like a stress-free job because even when you're dealing with hazards like a bear outside your tent, it's amazing how it clarifies the mind. It's like so much of what actually stresses us out is things that have never actually happened, but we're worried about hypotheticals. What could happen next week? What could happen financially? What could happen with the mortgage? You know, what could happen with this doctor's appointment? But when you're in the wilderness, you don't, without even trying, you're focused on the moment. You're living in day-tight compartments. Everything that happened before today doesn't matter. Everything that can happen the next day doesn't matter. All that matters is right now, getting through these rapids or getting away from this bear or getting around this cliff. So you're just sort of living in that moment. And ironically, it's actually very relaxing. It feels like all this weight has been taken off your shoulders. So there's definitely something to be said for that. And I think people get a little taste of it when they do some sort of like heavy workout or they go for a jog and they feel like, I found it relaxing doing that. And it's kind of like that, just a little more extreme. And that's something I actually look forward to on the long journeys, right? Just the freedom from distraction, from everything else, being totally immersed in this one project, and you lose yourself in the project. And you don't necessarily have to go into the wilderness to experience it. I imagine artists experience something similar to it when it's like, you know, we're going to put on this play. And for the next 6 months, my life is this play and nothing outside of it. And all of this theater rehearsing, I mean, it's like I completely forgot about what was going on in the world. I forgot about everything else. I was too immersed in my project, my creative work, to worry about anything else. And you can get that with any sort of task, like you're renovating your house, we're building a new kitchen off the back or something like that. And it's like, you know, actually working with our hands and being immersed in this was ironically sort of relaxing because we didn't spend all the time worrying about all the stuff that doesn't actually matter, that we do on a daily basis the rest of the time.
It sounds like that's sort of more of a natural state, would you say? Like when you feel like that, you're not modern world bombarded by this, that, and the other, but when you're kind of in nature, you're kind of in the moment more. And that's, I think, probably what we're sort of supposed to be like. The kind of state we're supposed to be in, you know, like we talked about at the beginning of this chat, you know, it hasn't been that long at all since humans started living in society, and how do we unpack, you know, thousands and thousands of years of evolution into such a quick change when we're being bombarded by things. And I think part of the reason doing these big trips is so amazing is because it forces you to kind of be in that natural state, and having the book at the same time as well is and sharing it with people is awesome. I can kind of relate to that. I have to, you know, because I am doing some filming on my trip, but you know, I'm not writing a novel out there. So just reflecting on what you did and writing, it just sounds like such an awesome process to be part of a larger adventure too, man. So I just, you know, I wanted to say, man, thanks a lot for coming out and for having a chat and driving all the way up here and sitting down with me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem, Adam. Hopefully we can do it again sometime.